On March 17th, 1971, my entire life changed. That was the day that I became Victoria Lord and moved to Landview. Never did I dream that I would still be there 27 years later. Since my first day on the set, I have always felt that Landview is a living, breathing community housed within a stone building on West 66th Street in New York City. We've had a most extraordinary collection of characters who have lived in or visited our town. Some came for a short while. Others, like me, found a good home and stayed. But Landview is not just made up of actors. It is also home to all the writers, directors, producers, designers, all the people who put up our houses and hospital rooms and offices and parks every day, and then pack them up at night. It is made up of those who take care of us, dress us, and make us look good. Those who enable you to see and hear us. Those who type the scripts and make the phone calls. All those whose job it is to see that our town and our lives run smoothly every day. I have a brain full of memories of Landview, of actors and actresses I've worked with and enjoyed, of favorite plots, of mishaps and tricks we've played on each other, of all the wonderful times I have spent there. This book contains all the stories and people who have made Landview what it is, a history that lives in my mind and my heart. I hope you will enjoy it as much as I have. Dr. Larry Wolick. The words rolled off Anna's tongue. She was so proud of her kid brother Larry, who had overcome his humble beginnings to graduate at the top of his class. Now, the youngest Wolick sibling was embarking upon a bold new career as a psychiatric intern at nearby Landview Hospital. The three Wolick children, Anna, Vince, and Larry, were raised in a tiny apartment in the lower middle class section of Landview, Pennsylvania. When their parents died, Anna, a woman of great will, courage, and patience, had to be both a mother and sister to her two brothers. She toiled long hours as a cutter in a Philadelphia garment firm, but this did not stop her from doing the work that needed to be done in the Wolick home at night. Vince worked equally hard as a long-distance trucker, joining his sister to scrape up enough money to allow Larry to fulfill their collective dream, the American dream. Though he had been interning only a few short months, Larry already possessed a rare insight, an intuitive understanding of people and behavior. Landview Hospital's assistant head of housekeeping, Sadie Gray, the Wolecks' longtime across-the-hall neighbor, beamed with pride as she watched Larry go about his rounds. For the past few years, Larry had been like a son to her. But nothing could ever fill the void in Sadie's heart left by the disappearance of her own daughter, Clara, who had run away 9 years earlier at the age of 15. Clara Gray hadn't been heard from since. Soon after beginning his internship, Larry met Meredith Lord, a sweet and shy young volunteer in the hospital courtyard. Meredith fell instantly in love with Larry, much to the displeasure of her overbearing father, publishing tycoon Victor Lord, the richest man in Landview. Stuffy Mr. Lord considered Larry Wolick to be little more than fortune-seeking riffraff. Larry's brother, Vince, was equally disdainful of Meredith, constantly calling her that rich society snob. Victor pushed Meredith into an engagement with a man he believed was more fitting of her social standing. But Meredith confided in her older sister, Victoria, that she didn't love Dr. Ted Hale, even if he was heir to one of Philadelphia's mainline families. She much preferred sharing a cozy afternoon in the hospital courtyard with Larry than attending a society party with Ted. Meredith enjoyed her afternoon chats with Larry. Alone in the courtyard, she opened up about the pain she felt over never having known her mother, Eugenia, who passed away soon after giving birth to her. Meredith grew up frail and sickly, but now, for the first time in her life, she felt strong enough to go against her father's wishes and break up with Ted Hale. In July 1968, Meredith broke her engagement. In One Life to Live's first episode, July 15, 1968, Dr. Ted Hale took a deadly fall down the fourth-floor fire escape landing, and the Landview police immediately charged Larry Wolick with his murder. Larry and Ted had been having an argument, part of which was overheard by a nurse, Karen Martin, and Larry's fellow intern, Price Trainer. Though Larry insisted to the police that Ted simply lost his footing and fell, Karen told another story. She told the police that Larry and Ted had been arguing about Meredith. She claimed to have heard Larry threaten Ted. Larry vehemently denied this accusation, but he was lying. He had threatened Ted, but only after Meredith's spurned fiancé threatened to tell her a terrible secret. Ted knew something that Larry desperately wanted to keep from Meredith. Ted knew that Meredith was dying. Ted Hale had stumbled across Meredith's confidential medical records and discovered that she was terminally ill with a malignant blood disease. "Break up with Meredith now, or I'll go down and tell her the truth," Ted coldly ordered Larry while standing on the fire escape landing. He never had the chance to reveal his secret. As Ted turned away from Larry, he tripped and fell down the steps to his death. Larry Woloch risked his promising career and compromised his personal reputation to keep Meredith from discovering the terrible truth about her failing medical condition. Keeping the reason for his altercation a secret, even from his lawyer, Dave Siegel, Larry stood trial and was nearly convicted of murder. However, in a closed-door session, the truth eventually came out, and Larry was freed. The court records were sealed, sparing Meredith the news that she only had a precious few months to live. Larry Woloch hoped to spend every last minute with the woman he loved. One day, while being treated at Landview Hospital for what she was told was anemia, Meredith suddenly vanished. Soon after, Larry received a letter from her ending their relationship. She didn't love him, Meredith claimed. Nurse Karen Martin was more than willing to offer Larry a shoulder to cry on. For months, she had loved Dr. Woloch from afar, and this was her chance to grab him. When Meredith returned several weeks later, she spurned Larry's overtures to get back together. Bewildered, he wept in Karen Martin's open arms. Unbeknownst to Larry, Meredith had overheard the truth about her deadly blood disease. Not wanting to burden Larry, she ran away to San Francisco, then sent him the Dear John letter. It pained her deeply to walk away from Larry, but in her heart, Meredith truly believed she was doing the right thing. Burying her private anguish and concealing her true affections, Meredith pushed Larry toward Karen. Though Larry did not love Karen Martin, he treasured their friendship and felt a certain obligation to her when she saved his life. Early in the winter of 1969, Larry had been napping in a hospital when a fire suddenly broke out. With the heat of the flames beating down on her, Karen crawled through the storeroom, bravely risking her life to rescue the unconscious Dr. Woloch. For weeks, Larry's face, burned in the fire, remained wrapped in bandages. Nurse Karen Martin stayed by his side throughout the ordeal, listening as her feverish patient called out Meredith's name in his sleep. Upon his recovery, Larry gave in to Karen's seductive overtures and made love to her. All the while, the forlorn doctor still yearned to be with Meredith, who continued to deny him. Miraculously, Meredith's condition improved dramatically in 1969, prompting Larry's heart to leap with the hope that they could be together again. Though she was in remission, Meredith continued to resist Larry, not wanting to give him false hope. Eventually, she gave in and admitted her love. Larry rejoiced at the news. He and Meredith were back together at last. But not for long. Just days later, Karen broke the news to Larry that she was pregnant with his child. Karen gave Larry 24 hours to decide. If he didn't marry her, she would destroy their baby. Not wanting Karen to have an illegal abortion, Larry, devastated, sacrificed his own happiness and entered into a loveless marriage with Karen Martin. Meredith found solace with a young man she met in the park. Being the good and trusting soul that she was, Meredith insisted that the man, who suffered from amnesia, come home with her until his mystery could be solved. She gave him the name Tom Edwards, Edwards being the name of her cat. Meredith immediately acknowledged that she and Tom shared a common bond. He didn't seem to have a past, and she might not have a future. Tom fell madly in love with Meredith. and before long they were engaged to marry. Victor took an immediate liking to the young man, treating him like a son. In fact, Victor Lord had a son, one that he had never met. Years earlier, Victor had a wartime affair with a woman named Dorothy Randolph. For years, Victor had searched in vain for the child she gave birth to, who was now a grown man. Even after Karen Martin Wolek miscarried and she and Larry separated, Meredith was still determined to go through with her marriage to Tom Edwards. After all, Tom had been such a dear friend in her time of need. She felt obliged to become his wife. However, Tom could see that the love between Larry and Meredith was too strong to be broken by even matrimonial vows. Gallantly, he released Meredith from her promise. Finally, Larry and Meredith were free to marry. At Landfair, the sprawling 18th century home of the Lord family, Meredith's sister, Victoria, was thrilled to learn of the reconciliation. Only 5 years older than Meredith, Vicky had always assumed a motherly role toward the sister she affectionately called Mary, though she didn't tell her father how happy she was about Larry and Meredith's reconciliation. Victoria Lord had always placed her blustery father on a pedestal. In Vicky's eyes, father could do no wrong. Strangely, she remembered nothing of her mother's death and felt an uneasy sense of dread every time she tried to recall her passing. Why, she wondered. Why can't I remember anything? Upon Eugenia's death, Victor Lord had thrown himself into his work, concentrating on grooming Victoria to take over the reins of his family-owned newspaper, The Banner. Without a son to follow in his footsteps, Victor put his eldest daughter through years of strict training and emotional pressure so that she would be prepared to carry the mantle. But how could Vicky live up to the impossibly high standards of the Lord name? As executive assistant to the publisher, Victoria Lord poured all her energies into The Banner, thereby pleasing her father. Though a strikingly beautiful young woman, she had little time or inclination for romance. Since her father would certainly disapprove of any young man she would have dated, she had long repressed any desire to become involved in a romantic relationship. Meredith implored Vicky to break the ties to their father and to avail herself of the opposite sex. Most men were intimidated by the cold, businesslike Victoria, except one. He was the Banner's star reporter, Joseph Francis Riley, a charismatic fellow from, like his best pal, Vince Wolek, the wrong side of the Landview train tracks. Joe and Vicky clashed often as they worked side by side at the Banner. Eventually, though, he wore down her resistance. Joe stirred feelings in Vicky that she had never experienced before. She was falling in love, much to the consternation of her father, who vehemently disapproved of the budding romance. Victor did everything in his power to separate his daughter from this hard-drinking, hard-living cad. Vicky was terribly torn between loving this charming and sexy man and pleasing her always demanding father. This internal dilemma caused her to have splitting headaches. To complicate matters, Vicky began receiving a series of threatening notes, calling for her to end her relationship with Joe. Who could be sending them? The answer lay deep in Vicky's psyche. In the fall of 1968, a bubbly gal named Nikki Smith began making nightly appearances at Ernie's, a seedy waterfront bar. Several regulars noted, but discounted, the fact that this fun-loving floozy bore a strong physical resemblance to heiress Victoria Lord. If they only knew the truth, Nikki was Vicky. Suffering from a split personality, the normally reserved Vicky donned a wig, slapped on a ton of makeup, and painted the town red as her flashy alter ego. To Vince Wolek, Nikki Smith was the perfect woman. The minute he set eyes on her, he was in love. Vince told his best pal Joe Riley all about his zesty encounters with the vibrant bombshell in places like Ernie's and another seedy hotspot, the Cave. Eventually, Vinny's heart was broken when he learned the truth, that Nikki did not exist at all. Selflessly, he told Vicky of Nikki's existence, and with the support of her friends and family, she sought treatment with Llanview Hospital's chief of psychiatry, Dr. Marcus Polk. As the Nikki episode slowly waned, Vicky went ahead with plans to marry Joe Riley. However, on their wedding day in late June of 1969, Nikki Smith suddenly returned in the middle of the ceremony and fled the church. With an overjoyed Vince Wolick at her General Hospital's Dr. Steve Hardy journeyed from Port Charles to Llanview to consult on Meredith Lord's malignant blood disease. Here, Dr. Hardy confers with Dr. Jim Craig, Victoria Lord, and Joe Riley. As they sped toward the state line, Vince realized that he probably didn't have any friends left back in Llanview. But he didn't care. He had Nikki. She was back, but not for long. When Vince insisted that she marry him immediately, Nikki panicked. Pushed into a matrimonial corner, Nikki's only escape was to allow Vicky to emerge. She returned home, reunited with Joe, and took major leaps to overcome her split personality. Vicky finally remembered writing the threatening notes, then recalled the one memory from her distant past that she had blocked out. With Dr. Polk's guidance, Vicky remembered seeing a terrible argument between her parents at the top of the steep spiral staircase at Llanfair. Victor, raging with anger, confronted his wife with his suspicion that her unborn child had been fathered by another man. Eugenia suddenly lost her balance and plummeted to the bottom of the steps. To 5-year-old Victoria, it may have appeared that her father pushed her mother to her death. Soon after, Eugenia Lord gave birth to a tiny little girl, Meredith, then quietly passed away. Seemingly free at last of the inner turmoil that had driven her psyche to fragment, Vicky married Joe, this time without an uninvited appearance by Nikki Smith. Tears rolled down the cheeks of Joe's sister, the former Eileen Margaret Riley, who admiringly watched the proceedings with her loving husband, Dave Siegel, and their teenage twins, Timmy and Julie. Even Anna Wallach, who had loved Joe from afar since they were kids playing in the streets of Philly, was happy that Joe had finally found peace and happiness with his beloved Vicky. Dr. Jim Craig, Llanview Hospital's newly arrived chief of staff, was baffled by the case of a patient, aspiring actress, Carla Benari. Miss Bahari seemed to suffer from the early stages of cirrhosis of the liver, a condition possibly brought on by malnutrition. Dr. Craig, a widower with a teenage daughter, Kathy, took more than a professional interest in Carla's case. He was intrigued by Miss Benari, whom he believed had an emotional problem that may have been contributing to her medical malady. Jim Craig soon fell in love with his pretty young patient. Carla responded affirmatively when Jim tenderly asked her to marry him. Why shouldn't she? Though they had only known each other a short time, he offered her an abundance of security, warmth, and companionship. But deep in her heart, Carla knew that she didn't love him, and this troubled her. Was she willing to settle for a man she didn't love? Dr. Craig assigned Carla's case to Dr. Price Traynor, an idealistic black intern who immediately butted heads with his new patient. Months passed, and Carla realized that there was an exciting chemistry in the air every time she was near Dr. Traynor. It's a chemistry that makes us fight every time we encounter each other, she finally told him. Price knew exactly what it was, love, but he felt guilty and ashamed to have fallen in love with a white woman. Carla took a job as Dr. Jim Craig's secretary and settled into life in Llanview. One day, Carla paid a surprise visit to Anna Wolick, a friend she had met at Llanview Hospital. As she knocked at the door, Sadie Gray opened the door of her apartment across the hall. "I'm sorry, miss. The Wolicks aren't home. Can I take a message for you?" Carla turned in response, but stopped cold when she saw Sadie. There was a long, awkward moment of awareness, then recognition, followed by mutual shock. Finally, the words came in a whisper. "Clara," uttered Sadie. "Mama," responded Carla. Carla Benari was really Clara Gray, the daughter who'd broken Sadie's heart when she walked out of her life as a teenager. Carla, a fair-skinned black woman, had been passing herself off as white while trying to get her acting career off the ground. Sadie listened in astonishment to the details of her tale, then challenged Carla to face the shameful reality of what she had done. When you ran away from here 9 years ago, you didn't only turn your back on me, you turned your back on all of us, said Sadie. She tried to make her daughter deal with the fact that she was engaged to a white doctor, but in love with a black one. Baring her soul, Carla explained to Sadie that she hadn't asked to be born with lighter skin than many other black people. She revealed the pain and embarrassment she felt for not looking black enough. Finally, Carla unloaded all her pent-up hostility on Sadie as she recalled the pain of her lonely childhood. I sat and I ate my lunch all alone in that empty house, and all the time I knew that somewhere across town you were fussing over somebody else's children, explained Carla. When I came home from school, I was filled up with all kinds of things that I wanted to tell you, but you weren't there to tell. And when you finally came home, you were so damn exhausted that you didn't have that much time for me. You had used up everything that you had to give on strangers that I didn't even know. Eventually, Sadie and Carla came to an understanding. Through their frank talks, Carla came to the realization that she could never be anything but what she really was. Carla ended her engagement to Jim and broke the news of her true heritage to Price, who was angry. Proud of his heritage, Price bitterly rejected Carla because she had rejected her race. Eventually, Price and Carla contemplated marriage, much to the displeasure of Price's snobby mother, Grace, who arrogantly peered down her nose at her son's choice for a wife. Grace Traynor didn't feel that Carla, the daughter of a hospital housekeeper, was the right kind of woman for her precious Price. There's so much more to being right for each other than love, Grace haughtily told the son she kept under her thumb. Though very much in love with him, Carla resented Price's inability to think for himself. When Grace arranged for Price to take a fellowship in Edinburgh, the young doctor was faced with a dilemma. Should he stay in Llanview with Carla, or accept the great honor bestowed upon him by Edinburgh University in Scotland? Carla wrote him a note telling Price that, "I just won't decide for you. Since it's your life, it has to be up to you." Carla left town for a week, returning to learn that Price, mistakenly believing that Carla, by her passivity, wanted him to avail himself of the opportunity, had gone to Scotland. Heartbroken, she accepted comfort from Bert Skelly, the prominent black district attorney and congressional candidate who became the new man in her life. Jim Craig never thought it could happen again, but soon after his breakup with Carla, he fell in love with Anna Wolick. After Anna joyously married Jim, she suddenly found herself dealing with the reality of a rebellious teenage daughter growing up in a volatile time, the 1960s. Kathy Craig resented Anna's sudden intrusion in her life. Disobedient by nature, Kathy turned to drugs. At first, the troubled young girl forged blanks from her father's prescription pad to get drugs for herself. Later, she sought out a pusher to provide the pills to satisfy her growing addiction. After discovering what she was up to, Jim didn't want to deal with the reality of Kathy's problems. But it was Kathy who finally persuaded her father to take her to New York City's Odyssey House to help in her recovery. As the drug problem in Llanview grew worse, reporter Joe Riley began an investigative series in the Banner. Joe's probing worried his new wife, Vicky, who feared for his safety. Vince Wolick, a truck driver, inadvertently became a partner in crime when he became romantically involved with Millie Parks, who was secretly working with mobster Artie Duncan in the drug trade. According to Artie's scheme, Millie was to get Vince to unknowingly transport drugs across state lines. Eventually, Millie's love for Vince and her guilt over what she had done enabled her to go to the authorities. Soon after, Artie's dead body was discovered in Vince Wolick's apartment. As the evidence stacked against him, Vince was charged with murder. With Vince locked behind bars, Joe Riley began his own private mission to prove the innocence of his longtime friend. Joe's investigation during the summer of 1970 took him across the country to California. Vicky waited anxiously for her husband to return from his dangerous quest. As the days passed without word from Joe, Vicky's fear grew. Then news came from the coast. Joe's car had careened off a cliff and was found amongst the rocks and surf. Though his body was not recovered, the authorities concurred that Joe Riley could never have survived the deadly plunge. Devastated by the loss of her beloved husband, Vicky's only joy came when Vince Wallach was cleared of Artie Duncan's murder. The case was resolved when Kathy Craig remembered that she had killed the drug-dealing mobster in self-defense, then blocked out the tragic incident. Vicky shared her grief with Joe's sister, Eileen Siegel, who was dealing with her own teenage problems at home. Newspaperman Steve Burke was the kind of mature and stable gentleman Victor Lord always hoped that his daughter Victoria would marry. After Joe Riley's death, Steve encouraged a devastated Vicky to move on with her life. Working side by side at the Banner, they got off to a rocky start, but eventually they fell in love and shared a quiet marriage, though Vicky could not stop longing for her beloved Joe. Eileen and Dave Siegel were dismayed when their daughter Julie moved in with her older boyfriend, former football hero Jack Lawson. Head over heels in love with Jack, Julie yearned to get married. But Jack, always the cad, had other ideas and other women. When Julie finally realized that her lover was less than faithful, she nearly suffered a nervous breakdown. During this difficult period in her life, she met a new man, Dr. Mark Toland. Mark, a Landview Hospital intern with a captivating Texas twang, quickly captured Julie's heart. They married in 1971, but Dr. Toland soon discovered that his new wife, still emotionally scarred by her breakup with Jack, was frigid. In time, his patience wore thin. The Toland marriage was in big trouble. Larry and Meredith Wallach could not have been happier in their new marriage. By 1972, Larry had changed his medical interest from psych-A to internal medicine and was actively treating the less fortunate sit-ins stacked against citizens of Landview in the hospital's free clinic. By offering the best possible aid to those who couldn't afford it, Larry was paying back society for support that his family and friends had given him in medical school. To complete her happiness, Meredith decided she wanted a baby. Larry, sensitive to her blood condition, which was still in remission, anonymously did not think it wise for her to get pregnant. But Mary was so adamant, so convincing in her desire, that Larry gave in. Soon, twins were on the way. Meredith spent much of her pregnancy in bed, under strict medical supervision. Sadly, one of the twins was stillborn. The other, a boy named Dan, was born healthy and robust. After the tragedy, Meredith became deeply depressed. Larry sought the counsel of a celebrated psychologist, Dr. Joyce Brothers, to help his troubled wife come to grips with her fears. In the year following Joe's death, a new man, Steve Burke, entered Vicky's life. Victor Lord brought the veteran newspaperman in to serve as the Banner's new executive editor. Steve was the kind of level-headed conservative man that Victor had always envisioned for his daughter. The manipulative Mr. Lord schemed to throw Steve and Vicky together, with disastrous results. Steve, more than a decade older than Vicky, found himself profoundly attracted to her quiet charm and captivating beauty. Still deep in mourning, Victoria Lord Riley initially chafed at Steve's efforts to take her on a date. But after many months, she finally returned Steve's feelings, and they planned to marry. Vince Wallach, along with Joe's sister Eileen, was appalled at Vicky's decision to remarry. They had refused to give up hope that Joe was gone. Both bristled when Vicky signed the papers declaring Joseph Francis Riley legally dead. Though she was set to marry Steve, Vicky continued to have nightmares that Joe was alive. Pushing the doubts from her mind, she plunged ahead with wedding plans. Vince and Eileen's objections were not the only obstacles in the way of Vicky's happy future with Steve. Steve's brilliant young secretary, Marcy Wade, secretly carried a torch for her boss. Intensely jealous, Marcy grew to hate Victoria Lord. She couldn't let that whimpering little duchess marry her beloved Steve, Learning of Vicky's problems with a split personality, Marcy developed a devious plan to get Steve for herself. Marcy schemed to drive Vicky over the edge by making her believe that Nikki Smith had returned. She even went so far as to don a wig and show up at Ernie's to offer conclusive proof to Vicky that her alter ego had returned. However, Marcy's skillful scheme backfired. Vicky's deep troubles over the Nikki matter actually brought her closer to Steve. Slipping deeper into psychosis, Marcy added a murderous tangent to her evil plan. If all went right, she intended to kill Vince Wolek and frame Nikki Smith for the crime. However, before she could carry out the plan, Steve discovered the depth of Marcy's deception and confronted her outside a warehouse on the docks of the Lantano River. Marcy, dressed in her Nikki Smith disguise, pulled a gun on Steve, then craftily announced a change in plans. "It won't be Vinny that Vicky thinks she killed. It will be you," she cackled maniacally. Realizing he was about to die, Steve took a chance. He lunged for the gun. During the subsequent struggle, Marcy dropped her purse. A vagrant suddenly appeared, grabbed it, and ran. Just then, the gun went off, and Marcy fell to the ground, dead. Lieutenant Ed Hall of the Landview Police Department launched an investigation into Marcy's death. Though Steve proclaimed his innocence, Lieutenant Hall developed his own theory, that Steve and Marcy were having an affair behind Vicky's back, and that when Marcy planned to blow the whistle on him, Steve killed her. Vicky watched in horror as her fiancé was charged with first-degree murder. With all the evidence stacked against him, Steve's future looked bleak. Only Marcy's black patent leather purse containing an incriminating note saying that Nikki Smith planned to kill Vince Wolek could save him. But where could it be? On the waterfront, a mysterious, unshaven man who had read accounts of Steve's plight located the missing purse in the belongings of another vagrant named Charlie. Now this stranger held the evidence that could exonerate Steve Burke. The man was Joe Riley. Suffering from a potentially fatal brain aneurysm, Joe stumbled into a local Landview diner and passed out. He was befriended by Wanda Webb, a tough-talking waitress with a huge heart. Wanda tenderly nursed Joe back to health and fell in love with the handsome stranger in the process. Fearing that he was going to die, Joe did not want to make his presence known to his loved ones, but he had to do the right thing and get the purse to the authorities. So he surreptitiously sent the purse to his brother-in-law, Steve's lawyer, Dave Siegel, and the evidence gained Steve Burke's acquittal. Anguished and very weak, Joe gathered the strength to leave Landview, sticking around long enough to lurk in the bushes at Landfair to watch Vicky marry another man. Steve and Vicky, blissfully happy, left on their honeymoon just as Joe collapsed and was rushed to Landview Hospital. The news of Joe Riley's amazing return delighted the residents of Landview, especially his devoted sister Eileen. Joe pleaded with Eileen, Jim, and Victor Lord not to notify Vicky, but in his weakened condition, he could not fight the inevitable. After a delightful honeymoon, Steve and Vicky returned to Landview to be greeted by the startling news about Joe. Vicky promptly fainted. Upon recovering, she raced to Landview Hospital in time to catch Joe and Wanda slipping out a side door. Standing in the hospital corridor, Vicky and Joe stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. As she whispered his name, Joe took a step forward, then collapsed at her feet. His life or death would soon be determined by a delicate operation to repair the aneurysm in his brain. Joe regained consciousness, and at the sight of Vicky, his will to live surfaced. He decided that one day they would be together again. Joe's operation was successful, but now Vicky was faced with an intense dilemma. Which husband should she choose, Joe or Steve? Joe Riley made a full recovery from brain surgery and prodded Vicky into choosing between her two men. "I know that whatever decision you make, it will be the right one. Sure as my name's Joe Riley," he tenderly told her. "I'll still love you, as I always have and always will. And I'll understand." Vicky admitted to herself and her loved ones that she cared equal o'er Joe and Steve, but since she was Steve's wife now, her duty was to him. Still, she could not get Joe out of her mind. As the weeks passed, Vicky's resistance to Joe increasingly wore down until fate finally intervened. While covering an avalanche in the mountain community of Mount Jefferson during the winter of 1973, Vicky and Joe found themselves staying at the same hotel. Working together again, the old chemistry came bounding back. "To the greatest reporting team since Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John," said Joe as he toasted his lady love with a flute of champagne. As the snow fell gently outside their window, Joe and Vicky shared a night of laughs, memories, and dancing. As they slowly swayed to the music of a toy carousel music box, it was as if the years between them no longer existed. As the music ended, Joe and Vicky sank down onto the bed and made love. The next morning, Vicky, torn by her love for Joe and her sense of duty to Steve, informed Joe that their night together had not changed things. She could not leave Steve. "I want us to be friends, Joe, I really do," she gently told him. But after their night of passion, Joseph Riley was not about to let the woman he loved walk out of his life. A bitter argument ensued, causing Vicky to flee the hotel in tears. She jumped in her car and recklessly drove off, straight into an accident. The car crash left Vicky comatose for months. When she was finally transferred back to Landview Hospital, doctors determined that Vicky was suffering from a psychogenic coma. Because of the dilemma she faced, Vicky did not want to wake up. It wasn't until her sister Meredith pleaded with her to open her eyes that Vicky finally emerged from her coma. Upon her recovery, Vicky stuck to her original plan and returned to Steve. Joe, crushed by her rejection, poured all his energies into assisting Kathy Craig with her first novel. Kathy, now an attractive, truly liberated woman, was Joe's savior during this difficult period. Although he was still very much in love with Vicky, Joe allowed himself to be seduced by Kathy. As the months passed, Vicky realized that the joy she once shared with Steve was long gone. A personal tragedy in 1973 helped Vicky realize that she should end her marriage to Steve. Two ruthless thieves, Earl Brock and Ben Howard, broke into Landfair in search of Victor Lord's priceless art collection. When their robbery went awry, the two thieves held Meredith and her brother-in-law, Vince, hostage in the Wolex's garage apartment. Days passed as the police, led by Lutton Ed Hall, negotiated with Brocky and Howard for the safe release of the hostages. As negotiations broke down, Meredith and Vinny attempted a last-ditch escape. During the confusion, the police broke in, and Meredith slipped and hit her head on the floor. Larry watched in horror as an ambulance rushed his beloved Mary to the hospital, where his fellow doctors determined that the blow to her head had caused a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Meredith serenely accepted her fate. Knowing she was dying, Mary peacefully whispered to Vicky to let Larry know how happy he had made her. After saying her final goodbyes to her loved ones, Meredith Lord Wolek gently left this world. Llanview mourned the untimely passing of this sweet angel who had graced their presence for such a short time. Now a police officer, Vince Wolek went beyond the call of duty when he befriended rebellious street urchin Joshua West. The troublesome bad boy chose to follow a straight and narrow path under the guidance of his adoptive parents, Ed and Carla Hall. Meredith's death made Vicky realize how precious true love can be. More than ever, she knew that her heart was with Joe. Finally, she mustered the courage to ask Steve Burke for a separation. Though furious at first, Steve finally relented and agreed to let her go. He remained in Llanview, enjoying a short-term relationship with Kathy Craig before accepting a new position as a foreign correspondent for the Banner. At long last, Joe and Vicky could be together. Vicky hurried to the Caribbean to finalize the end of her marriage, but upon her return, she was faced with terribly shocking news. Kathy Craig was pregnant with Joe's baby. Kathy had kept her impending motherhood a closely guarded secret. When Joe found out, he offered to marry her. Kathy refused his generous offer, insisting that she was a modern woman who could raise her child alone. Quietly, Vicky and Joe overcame the shock and remarried in a simple ceremony in New York City. Wanda, who had loved Joe from afar, soon found happiness with his best friend, Vince Wolick. Much to the delight of the residents of Landview, Vince, now a cop, made the wisecracking waitress his bride. Vince's friend, Lilty Ned Hall, found himself a wife when he married Carla Gray, who had ended her relationship with former DA, current Congressman Bert Skelly. Ed and Carla's new marriage was immediately put to the test when they adopted a rebellious young street urchin, Joshua West. Dave Siegel did not live long enough to see any of his friends tie the knot. Sadly, Landview's much-admired attorney passed away from a massive heart attack. His widow, Eileen, turned to painkillers to numb her grief. Eileen eventually sought treatment from Landview Hospital's newest staff member, Dr. Dorian Kramer. Cool and aloof, Dorian moved into a big house near Landfair with her neurotic younger sister, Melinda, who had once been a promising piano prodigy. Sadly, Melinda's budding career was cut short when a fall from a horse left the timorous girl with a paralyzed left arm. When they learned of the accident, Dorian and Melinda's parents hired a small plane to fly to Melinda's side. Sadly, they never made it. The plane crashed, killing the senior Kramers. The series of tragedies devastated Dorian, who had lost her other sister, Agatha, to pneumonia at the age of 13. Melinda was her only family, and Dorian became unduly devoted to fulfilling her troubled sister's every need. Saddled with guilt, Melinda encouraged her workaholic sister to find a husband. But Dorian just didn't see a permanent man in her future. "You won't let yourself date because you have to take care of me," argued Melinda. Though the thoroughly unpleasant Dorian wasn't looking for a husband, she did have a notorious history of stealing married men away from their wives. Her handsome fellow doctor, Mark Toland, became an easy target. Despite ongoing therapy, Mark's wife, Julie, still had sexual problems that left their marriage on shaky ground. Mark, unfulfilled and frustrated with Julie's frigidity, found what he needed in Dorian Kramer's bed. Dorian rented a small apartment where she carried out her private fantasies with Mark. Eventually, Melinda stumbled upon Dorian's secret and became furious because she had developed a crush on Mark, too. Melinda Kramer was fed up with living in her sister's shadow. She dreamed up a vicious plot to stab the lovers in their love nest. Emerging from her hiding place, she lunged for Mark. The blade sliced open his hand, but he managed to subdue his attacker. In the aftermath of her failed scheme, Melinda slipped into catatonia. Dorian, guilt-ridden but relieved that her secret was still safe, shipped Melinda away to a mental institution in Hartford. In the spring of 1975, Kathy Craig gave birth to a girl, Megan Riley Craig. Just days later, Kathy panicked when her precious baby stopped breathing. Doctors determined that Megan suffered from a congenital heart defect passed on by her father, Joe Riley. Though the baby underwent a corrective surgical procedure, neither Kathy nor Joe were told the dreadful news. Megan would never live past adolescence. Vicky pleaded with Larry not to tell Joe that he had given Megan her fatal ailment and that any child they might have could suffer the same fate. Knowing Joe would never allow his wife to have children if he knew of the hazards, Vicky vowed to keep the news from him. After Meredith's death, Larry Wolick buried himself in his work at Landview Hospital. At one point, he fell in love with one of his patients, a young woman named Rachel Wilson. Rachel, the former secretary to the Banner's Washington correspondent John Douglas, fell critically ill with Hodgkin's disease. Larry spent hours at her bedside, urging Rachel not to lose her will to live. Even when her health took a turn for the worse, Larry refused to give up hope. He grew so obsessed with Rachel Wilson that Dr. Jim Craig was compelled to remove him from the case. Rachel confided to her nurse, Susan Berry, that she wanted to die, and she hoped Larry would help her end her life. One day, after an argument with his lover Dorian, Dr. Mark Toland gave Rachel her medication, unaware that Dorian had already administered the required dose of potassium chloride. In her haste, Dorian had failed to initial the patient's chart. The accidental overdose killed Rachel. Mark quickly realized what had happened and joined with Dorian to cover up their negligence. Larry was arrested and accused of what the police deemed a mercy killing. Dr. Wolek stood trial and was found guilty of murder. As the roots of the bitter rivalry between Vicky and Dorian can be traced to events that took place in 1975. Down but not out, Dorian got her claws into Vicky's father, Victor Lord. Vicky tried to warn her father that Dorian was an opportunist, but to no avail. Mr. Lord was charmed by his cold-blooded new doctor. He languished in jail, the relationship between secret lovers. Mark and Dorian went sour. Dorian, riddled with guilt, went to Mark and threatened to tell Jim the truth about Rachel's death. In a panic, Mark bolted, and as Dorian chased after him, she stumbled and took a terrible fall down the stairs. For weeks, Dorian lay in a coma while Mark skipped town. After 6 weeks, Nurse Barry noticed that the comatose Dorian had begun mumbling, "Larry, potassium chloride, Mark, the initials." Susan raced to the authorities and told of this breakthrough, which she believed could be beneficial to Larry. Eventually, Dorian emerged from the coma and confessed her negligence in court. Her testimony set Larry Wolek free. Dorian was fined and suspended from Landview Hospital and blamed Vicky, a hospital board member, for the decision. She vowed to get revenge on the high and mighty Victoria Lord Riley. But Dr. Dorian Kramer quickly found work as the private physician-in-residence for Landview's most prominent citizen, Victor Lord, who had suffered a heart attack that confined him to bed. Vicky resented Dorian's presence in her family home and sought to convince her father to remove her from the premises. But Victor was adamant in his defense of Dorian, and it was readily apparent that he was charmed by her bedside manner. Dorian was equally beguiled by Victor's money, which afforded her the opportunity to get her mentally ill sister Melinda the finest medical care. Before long, Victor shocked everyone by revealing that he had made Dorian his wife. The thought sickened Vicky. Dorian, her stepmother? How could this be? Despite her abhorrence, Vicky could do nothing. Dorian Kramer was now Dorian Lord, mistress of lawn fair. With his health failing, Victor Lord renewed his quest to find the long-lost son he had fathered during a wartime liaison. Where could he be? Mark Tolan knew. While hiding out in South America, Mark discovered information about Victor's son and planned to use it to his own advantage. He slipped back into Landview and attempted to blackmail the greedy Dorian, who did not want Victor's heir to muck up her plans to inherit the Lord fortune. Dorian persuaded Mark to change his blackmail plans by giving him a juicy bit of news. Dorian had recently gotten hold of the information that Joe Riley had passed on a congenital heart problem to his daughter, Megan, and that Vicky was keeping the information from him. Mark's eyes lit up with dollar signs. He proceeded to blackmail Vicky, who confided her dilemma to Larry. Dr. Wolek urged Vicky to tell Joe the truth, but his words fell upon deaf ears. Vicky was determined to spare Joe and pay the money. However, before Vicky could drop the money at Mark Tolan's motel room, someone shot and killed him. Mark's killer turned out to be a drunken Susan Barry, whose unrequited love for Larry drove her to desperate lengths. Mistakenly thinking Larry and Vicky were having a motel room affair, Susan purchased a gun and set out to shoot the lovers. Arriving at the motel, she encountered Mark. In a besotted haze, Susan mistook Mark for Larry and shot him dead, then blocked out the incident. Months later, when the horrible memories came flooding back, Susan ran blindly into the street and was struck down by a motorcyclist. Vicky was horrified by this terrible turn of events, but she breathed a sigh of relief. The secret she was keeping from her husband, Joe, was safe for now. Around this time, a mysterious man named Tony Harris showed up. Tony had come to Landview bearing photos of the Lord family, and although it wasn't revealed at first, the handsome young was Victor's long-lost son. Eventually, Tony and Victor shared an emotional reunion, which only made Dorian deeply jealous and resentful. To keep Victor from writing Tony into his will, Dorian successfully schemed to turn the two men into bitter enemies. Thanks to her evil machinations, Victor and Tony were constantly at each other's throats. Tragedy struck when Kathy's daughter Megan was killed in a car accident. The baby had been having a respiratory attack, and Vicky, who had been babysitting for her, rushed to get her to the hospital. While pulling out of the driveway of her carriage house, Vicky's car skidded and crashed. Megan was killed, and for many weeks, Vicky languished in a deep coma. Upon her recovery, she vowed to get pregnant without telling Joe the inherent risk it posed to their child. But Kathy, convinced that Megan's death was not an accident, vowed revenge on Victoria Lord Riley. Eileen Siegel's spirits brightened when her son, Tim, came home from law school. Eileen was proud of her handsome son, who was planning to follow in the footsteps of her late husband. But once home, Tim broke the stunning news to his mother that he had dropped out of school. While working as a construction worker at Landview Hospital, Tim became instantly smitten with a beautiful young nurse, Jenny Wolek. Jenny, a distant cousin to Vince, Anna, and Larry, had come to Landview in the spring of 1975. She was equally charmed by Tim and grateful for the attention he lavished upon her. However, Jenny could not act upon her feelings because she was a novice nun about to take her final vows. Over the summer of 1975, Tim helped Jenny with volunteer work at a local Landview nursing home. She felt comfortable with him. In time, that comfort turned to love and heartache. Jenny, torn between her feelings for Tim Siegel and her commitment to God, decided to forego her final vows and marry the man she loved. But first, she agreed to honor her commitment to aid the innocent earthquake victims in the war-torn South American country of San Carlos. With a sweet kiss, Tim said goodbye to his bride-to-be as she flew away to South America. Soon after, he learned that several nuns had been killed in an explosion in San Carlos. Tim was horrified. Would he ever see his beloved Jenny again? Landview Hospital's new staff psychiatrist, Will Vernon, had his hands full with his first patient, Kathy Craig. Devastated by the news that she would never be able to have more children, Kathy lost touch with reality, then kidnapped Vicky's newborn son, Kevin. Tim Siegel waited anxiously for news of Jenny's fate. Had she been one of the 9 nuns killed in war-torn San Carlos? Soon word came. Jenny was injured, but alive. Suffering from malaria, Jenny was confined to the ICU unit at Landview Hospital. Accompanying her back to the States was a doctor, Jenny's dear friend, Peter Jansen. Tim could not help but notice the strong bond between Jenny and Peter. Despite his concerns, Tim knew in his heart that Jenny loved him, and upon her recovery, they stepped up their plans to marry. The wedding plans met with stiff resistance from Tim's mother, Eileen, and Jenny's hot-headed cousin, Vince. Eileen Siegel managed to convince the young lovers to put off the wedding until June, but Jenny changed her mind and moved the date up when she began waking nightly in a cold sweat with the frightening feeling that something terrible was going to happen to her. The revised plans met with plenty of opposition, especially from Vince Wolek. One day in mid-March, Vince and Tim had a confrontation in the hospital cafeteria. Both men lost their tempers, but Tim decided to walk away to avoid a physical confrontation. Turning on his heel, Tim headed for the nearest stairwell, with Vince in hot pursuit. Vince stopped him, and the argument resumed again. Tim had taken all he could stand. When his anger exploded, Tim swung at Vince, who ducked out of the way. Tim lost his balance, fell down the stairs, and suffered head and internal injuries. Fearing deep down in her soul that Tim would not survive, Jenny decided that they should marry immediately in the intensive care unit. Jenny, with tears in her eyes, held her beloved's hand as they were pronounced man and wife. Tim forced away the pain that racked his weakened body and smiled with joy knowing that Jenny was finally his wife. Within hours, his condition took a turn for the worse. The following afternoon, Tim Siegel died in Jenny's arms. Tim's passing took an emotional toll on his widowed mother, Eileen Riley Siegel. Joe Riley was a source of strength for his sister during the difficult weeks after the accident that took Tim's life. Privately, Joe was shaken by his nephew's death, coming so closely on the heels of his own daughter, Megan's untimely passing. Overwhelmed with grief, Joe finally broke down. Seeing her husband's tears tore Vicky apart. More than ever, she felt responsible for the death of Joe's only child, but soon his feelings would be buoyed by some incredible news. She was pregnant. After months of pain, Vicky was on the road to a complete recovery from the crippling injuries she'd sustained in the car crash, thanks inadvertently to her new stepmother, Dorian Kramer Lord. To upstage Vicky, Dorian had secretly planned a party in her own honor at Landfair. The wicked Dorian wanted to show everyone that she was now the lady of the manor and mistress of Landfair, a role always held by Vicky. But Dorian had another secret. She had removed Vicky's mother's portrait from its place of honor over the fireplace in the library and had replaced it with a huge painting bearing her own likeness. Dorian eagerly anticipated the moment when Vicky would walk into the library and see the new portrait. Walking with a cane, Vicky limped into the party and was, as expected, visibly shaken upon seeing Dorian's portrait hanging regally in the Lord Library. Vicky, always the quintessential lady, refused to give Dorian the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Instead, she quietly excused herself and went upstairs to seethe in private with Joe by her side. When Vicky was ready to return to the party, she stood at the top of the stairs with her cane, about to descend. Looking to embarrass Vicky, Dorian brought everyone into the foyer to watch. Defiantly, Vicky handed Joe her cane. Looking Dorian straight in the eye, she slowly and elegantly came down the stairs, as the guests burst into applause. Dorian's faint smile belied the humiliation she felt in every pore of her body. Meanwhile, Vicky was thrilled at the prospect of motherhood. She wanted so much to give Joe another child. And yet, she still could not bring herself to tell Joe the terrible truth, that their child could possibly be born with the same heart defect that had afflicted Megan. A feud between Victor Lord and his son Tony grew more heated in the new year, especially when Tony announced his plans to build a swinging singles bar on the same road that led to Landfair. Unbeknownst to Victor, Dorian, conspiring with her husband's protege, Matt McAllister, was doing whatever she could in her own clever way to widen the breach between father and son. At the same time, she persuaded Victor to change his will, making her the primary beneficiary. In time, though, Dorian's efforts began to fail. Sensing his own mortality, Victor's hostility toward Tony began to wane. Despite Dorian's tricks, father and son tentatively reached out to each other. Tony began a romance with Kathy Craig, and as their relationship grew more serious, Kathy began to suspect that there was more than met the eye to Tony's long-ago relationship with one of the new editors at the A Banner, Pat Kendall. She was right. 10 years earlier, Pat and Tony had engaged in a sizzling romance in Rio de Janeiro. Though she was now a married woman whose husband was missing and presumed dead, Pat Kendall was clearly still in love with Tony Lord. Thus, she was disheartened to learn that Tony had asked Kathy to marry him. Rather than go to him and confess her feelings, Pat avoided Tony. Meanwhile, Tony could not avoid the fact that Kathy, still emotionally wounded by the death of her baby, was beginning to lose touch with reality. When she learned that Vicky was pregnant, Kathy grew psychotic with rage. In the spring, Pat brought her 9-year-old son, Brian, to live with her in Landview. Brian, a bright and charming boy, was the joy of Pat's life. He had been raised right by his mother and her husband, Paul Kendall, a radical political activist who had gone underground in the turbulent early 1970s and was now presumed dead. Only Pat knew the truth. That Brian was Tony's son. Unable to bear the anguish a moment longer, Pat told the whole truth to her friend, Vicky, who helped her make a major decision. She resolved to fight for Tony. However, on the day Pat intended to speak to him, she discovered that Tony and Kathy had gone to a neighboring state to get married. Emotionally shattered, Pat realized that there was no longer any hope for her to be with the man she loved. As Tony slowly began to mend his relationship with his father, Victor, Dorian grew more incensed. She didn't want Victor to leave this bastard a penny of his vast fortune. Fearing that a father-son reunion would end her chances of inheriting the Lord fortune, Dorian stepped up her campaign against Tony. When Tony realized what she was doing, he went straight to Victor to tell him of his wife's treachery. Later, Victor lashed out at Dorian. Confronted with her lies, Dorian was forced to admit that she'd known before anyone else that Tony was Victor's son. The shock of this revelation proved too much for Victor. On April 30th, 1976, he crumpled to the floor of the Lord Library. Landview's most powerful figure had suffered a massive stroke that left him unable to speak. Determined to keep her husband from recovering, Dorian sprang into action. She succeeded in having Victor moved from the hospital back to Lanfair. Her devilish aim was to isolate him as much as possible from his children and thereby reduce the chances of them finding out about the climactic fight that had led to his stroke. Soon, a second stroke sent him back to the hospital. As his strength slipped away, Victor struggled to speak to Vicky. It became obvious, much to Dorian's distress, that he had something very important to tell his daughter. Sadly, Victor Lord didn't survive long enough to tell the truth about Dorian. Under very mysterious circumstances, Victor Lord died in June. Landview was stunned when Victor's will was read aloud, and Dorian, rather than Vicky, was given control of the estate. Tony received nothing. With a strong power base from which she could now operate, Dorian swiftly moved to take over the various operations of the Lord family empire. At the same time, she set her sights on a new conquest, Vicky's husband, Joe Riley, and she believed that she had just the ammunition she needed, for she had stumbled upon Vicky's secret. Armed with the news that Megan had died of a hereditary heart problem inherited from her father, Dorian accidentally told Joe, and all hell broke loose. Dorian's well-timed slip of the tongue left Joe devastated and led to the first serious breach in Vicky and Joe's marriage. They eventually reconciled and nervously looked forward to the birth of their baby. Tony, who had been fending his marriage to Kathy Roof going at best, now did all he could to keep his deranged wife from coming completely off the spool. Along with her father, Jim Craig, Tony was able to convince Kathy to seek help with Landview Hospital's new chief of psychiatry, Dr. Will Vernon, who had recently arrived in Landview with his wife, Naomi, and their two children, Brad and Samantha. Psychoanalysis did not seem to help Kathy. She lied to Tony, telling him she was pregnant when she hadn't even taken a pregnancy test. Kathy Craig was rapidly losing her mind. In September, Vicky went into premature labor and gave birth to a son, Kevin Lord Riley. Joe and Vicky were overjoyed to learn the wonderful news that their son did not have the heart defect that had afflicted Megan. The weeks following Kevin's birth were the happiest Joe and Vicky had ever experienced, until the October day they discovered their newborn son was missing. Kathy had kidnapped little Kevin. Lot et al. Was put in charge of the investigation. Weeks, then months, passed without word from Kathy. Joe pleaded publicly for Kathy to return the child. Dorian, who was in the midst of a studied campaign to revamp her image, put up reward money. Eventually, Kathy was apprehended, but the baby was nowhere to be found. Kathy, more delusional than ever, had no memory of ever marrying Tony. Worse, she had no memory of ever taking Kevin. Pat's support throughout this crisis made Tony realize how much she still meant to him. One night in mid-November, Pat and Tony gave in to their feelings and made love. Afterward, Pat pulled back, knowing that Tony had to give his full attention to Kathy if she ever was to make a full recovery. Riddled with guilt, Pat tearfully prepared to leave Landview forever. But fate intervened when, just as she made final plans to depart with Brian, the boy fell ill with a potentially fatal case of bacterial meningitis. Brad Vernon cared deeply for sweet Jenny Siegel, and so did his very married father, Will. While wooing the widowed ex-nun, Brad the Cad continued to carry on a secret affair with a former girlfriend, Lana McLean. After months of mourning the loss of her beloved Tim, Jenny met a young man who made her smile again, and he was handsome too. He was Brad Vernon, the son of Will and Naomi Vernon. Jenny was touched by Brad's sweetness and sincerity. Brad, who once dreamed of being a tennis pro, had suffered a severe knee injury that kept him from ever realizing his lofty goals. Brad began romancing Jenny and two-timing her too with Lana McLean, a local Llanview waitress. At first, Brad's only reason for pursuing the flame-haired waitress was to get her into the sack. Lana, sympathetic and naive, genuinely cared for Brad and mistakenly thought he felt the same way. Brad's parents, Will and Naomi, were going through their own personal hell. The Vernon marriage had never been the same since Will's affair 9 years earlier, which led Naomi to attempt suicide. Now Naomi Vernon's fears had returned. She began to suspect that Will was having an affair with his nurse, Jenny, the very same young woman who was dating their son. Seeing Jenny as a threat to her own marriage, Naomi began pushing her toward Brad. Late in the year, there was a major turning point in Brad and Jenny's relationship. It dawned on Brad that the sweet Jenny wasn't like all the other girls he had been with. She was different. She was a virgin, and he was falling in love with her. Dones and Anna Volek were thrilled with Larry's decision to open his own private medical practice. They were less than thrilled about his private life. Much to his siblings' chagrin, Larry began an affair with his second cousin, Jenny's sister, Karen. Karen Volek was everything that sweet Jenny was not. Karen was flashy, pushy, and ambitious. Raised by a family of modest means, Karen wanted to live the high life, and she saw Larry as her meal ticket. The first step in her master plan was to get him to join the country club, for the sake of improving his practice, of course. The second step was to get Larry to marry her. The third was to sweet-talk Larry into giving her the biggest, most expensive engagement ring in Llanview's local jewelry store. Each conquest proved easy for the beguiling Karen. It was just a matter of time before wedding bells would be ringing. 4 years after Meredith's death, Larry Volek found happiness again with his second cousin, Karen. Soon after their engagement, the bride-to-be ran into friction from Larry when he refused to honor her extravagant request to throw the biggest, most lavish wedding that Llanview has ever seen. Months passed, and in early 1977, there was still no word about Joe and Vicky's missing baby son, Kevin. By now, Joe was convinced that they would never see Kevin again, but he didn't dare share his fears with Vicky. To numb the pain, Joe began drinking heavily and found excuses to spend more time at the office. Finally, when he came home drunk one night too many, Joe and Vicky got into a major battle, and old wounds were reopened. Joe reminded Vicky of how she had withheld the truth about Megan's heart condition from him for so long. Vicky bitterly countered with the accusation that none of the present misery would have happened if Joe had not become involved with Kathy Craig, the demented young woman who had kidnapped Kevin. Dorian did everything in her power to widen the growing schism between the Rileys. The last straw came when Joe stayed out, and a furious Vicky discovered that he had gone on a drinking binge, then spent the night at Dorian's home Llanfair. This incident, coupled with Joe's loss of faith that their son was alive, made Vicky feel abandoned in every way. She asked Joey to move out. The unthinkable had happened. Vicky and Joe's marriage had shattered. With each passing day, Kathy's memory became a little clearer. Eventually, she provided the authorities with enough information to locate the woman with whom she had left baby Kevin. In a dramatic and poignant moment, the woman, Mrs. Magruder, handed Kevin over to Vicky. Tears flowed as she clutched her precious son in her arms for the first time in months. Vicky Riley vowed never to give him up again. Never. Joe was nowhere to be found during this emotional mother-son reunion. That same night, he had been in a barroom brawl, hit his head, and was hospitalized with a concussion. Upon learning that Kevin had been returned, Joe was overcome with guilt. In an emotional scene, he begged for Vicky's forgiveness and another chance for their marriage. Though the wounds were still deep, Vicky accepted Joe's request, and they reunited. All the while, Dorian lurked in the background, undaunted by the Riley reconciliation. Not for a moment had she given up her dream of eventually luring Joe from Vicky. One afternoon, Dorian stumbled upon Joe passed out at his desk. He wasn't drunk this time. Dorian discovered that for weeks Joe had been having headaches and periods of blurred vision. Behind Vicky's back, Dorian took Joe to New York for tests, which revealed some inconclusive brain irregularities, possibly a tumor. Dorian convinced Joe that until his problem could be properly diagnosed, it would be best to keep the information secret. Dorian insidiously worked her wiles on Joe, convincing him that it would be too much of a strain on Vicky if he were to reveal the terrible news that something was wrong with him. Weeks passed as Dorian tried unsuccessfully to use Joe's secret as the fuel to destroy his marriage to Vicky. Finally, Joe decided he could not keep quiet any longer. In a panic, Dorian knew that once Joe told Vicky, her own chances of winning him would be lost. But what could she do now? Dorian's opportunity came when Joe had another seizure at Land Fair and passed out. While he was unconscious, Dorian made a wreck of the room and tore her own dress. Then, when Joe came to, she managed to convince him that he was the one who had done all the damage in the room. Joe was terrified. Was he now capable of violence? Could he in some way harm Vicky or, heaven forbid, Kevin? Fearing for the safety of his loved ones, Joe persuaded Vicky to take Kevin away to their cabin in the mountains. While Vicky was away, Dorian pushed ahead with her evil efforts to get the vulnerable Joe into bed. She might have succeeded had it not been for the clever thinking of Dr. Peter Jansen, who stumbled upon Joe during a seizure and finally managed to get the whole story out of him. Dorian was frustrated when Peter persuaded Joe to face Vicky and tell her everything. Vicky listened in horror as Joe explained that he might be fatally ill. Trying to get over the initial shock, Vicky grew closer to her beloved Joe than she had ever been. Together they went to New York, where a second CAT scan revealed the grim news. Joe had a brain tumor. In a touch-and-go operation at Landview Hospital, the tumor was carefully removed. To Vicky's relief, it turned out to be benign. As Joe recovered, he made sure that the tumor wasn't the only thing cut from his life. He had finally succeeded in cutting Dorian Lord out of his life, too. As Kathy recovered from her mental illness, the kidnapping charges against her were dropped. To aid in her recovery, Tony promised Pat that he would do the right thing, return to Kathy and resume their marriage, at least until she was strong enough to face life on her own. By now, Pat had told Tony the incredible news that Brian was their son. Brian's illness had been the deciding factor in making Pat realize that Tony had a right to know the truth. However, both decided that it would be too traumatic to tell the boy the truth now, or even in the foreseeable future. During his recovery, Brian stubbornly had been refusing to give up his memory of his father, Paul Kendall. The big revelation would have to wait. Tony reluctantly went home to Kathy, but unnerved his wife by refusing to sleep with her. He yearned to be with Pat, who felt the pain of separation with every breath she took. Fortunately, Kathy, through counseling sessions with Dr. Will Vernon and deep discussions with her dear friend Larry Wallach, arrived at the conclusion that her situation with Tony was hopeless. Healthy at last, she gave him his freedom. The stage was set for Tony and Pat to finally be together. Realizing they would have to take their relationship one step at a time, Tony and Pat gently told Brian about their wedding plans and that their marriage would in no way erase or harm his memory of Paul Kendall. Brian lashed out, announcing that he hated Tony. On the eve of their wedding, Tony was critically injured in an automobile accident. Pat was barely over the shock of Tony's accident when she discovered that her husband, Paul Kendall, was not dead after all. Paul's return proved to be the beginning of a stormy emotional dilemma for Pat. Upon Tony's recovery, she broke the news to him that she had decided, for Brian's sake, that Paul would be moving back home. Within weeks, Tony and Pat began an affair behind Paul Kendall's back. One night, young Brian stumbled across his mother and Tony in an embrace. The incident proved traumatic for the boy, who kept what he saw a secret from everyone. With enormous hostility, Brian turned against his mother, telling her he hated her more than Tony. Only Brian's therapist, Dr. Will Vernon, was able to ascertain the truth, but Brian swore Will to secrecy. Early in 1977, no one was happier than Karen Wallach, who spent her every waking moment planning every last detail of the wedding to end all knee weddings. She wanted the biggest, most lavish affair that Llanview had ever seen. Her plans went smoothly until a week before the wedding, when a shady newcomer from her past showed up in Llanview. His name was Marco Dane. Karen was mortified to see Marco, who had been her lover when both were living in a commune out west. Marco, this low-life loser, could destroy everything she'd gained. As she feared, Marco threatened to blow the whistle on Karen. Marco Dane was one of the few people who knew that Karen Wallach had once been involved in an embezzlement scheme and spent 6 months on probation. If Larry found out about her past, he would never agree to marry a lying criminal like Karen. Karen confronted Marco, demanding that he leave town immediately. However, this sprite from the wild side wasn't going anywhere. He sadistically baited Karen, mysteriously refusing to divulge his plans. A chill ran down Karen's spine when Marco whispered that he planned to attend the wedding ceremony and make his move when the priest got to the part where he says, "If anyone can show just cause why, these two people should not be joined together in holy matrimony." Terrified, Karen went ahead with the wedding, and as planned, Marco showed up. But rather than stop the wedding, he remained strangely quiet. When the newlyweds returned from their honeymoon, Karen immediately returned to her old ways, sleeping late, not caring for Larry's son Danny properly, and spending much too much money. She cultivated a friendship with Dorian Lord, who became instrumental in helping Karen make elaborate plans for the new house Larry bought for her, plans which Larry and Karen obviously could not afford. Also during this time, Marco Dane got a job with Dorian as a handyman and errand runner. Karen quickly became bored with married life, and despite Larry's urging, she refused to change her profligate ways. At the same time, Larry began spending more and more time with hospital volunteer Kathy Craig. Their relationship deepened, though neither Larry nor Kathy were consciously aware yet of their mutual attraction. One day, a plumber, Gus, came to fix the pipes in the new Wallach house. When he flirted with Karen, she flirted right back and enjoyed it, so much she slept with him. Later, when she was in a local boutique, Karen tried on an expensive dress, one that she obviously could not afford on the budget Larry had given her. An older, obviously wealthy man stood in the background and admired her. He was Talbot Huddleston, a pillar of the community. Huddleston presented Karen with a tantalizing offer. He would buy her the dress if Karen agreed to have lunch with him. Karen accepted, but their rendezvous included more than just lunch. After a meal and a few glasses of wine, Karen returned to Huddleston's hotel room, where they made love. Before long, Karen was indulging her champagne tastes by having sex with a variety of men in exchange for extravagant gifts of jewelry and clothing. Karen wasn't the only Llanview resident keeping secrets. A sweet and seemingly innocent newcomer, Becky Lee Hunt, had come to Llanview to seek fame as a country and western singer. Becky Lee fell in love with Vicky's young cousin, Richard Abbott, who was working as a reporter for the Banner. Richard suspected that there was some element of mystery in Becky's recent past, and he was determined to find out what she was hiding. Dr. Will Vernon was also keeping a secret from everyone. Working side by side with Jenny, Will found himself falling in love. Naomi began to suspect that her husband harbored strong feelings for this young woman who was dating their son Brad. Naomi saw Jenny as a threat to her marriage and did everything in her power to push Jenny and Brad together. One night, while working late at the hospital, an anguished Will confessed to Jenny that he was in love with her. His powerful confession left Jenny consumed with guilt. She simply could not be responsible for the dissolution of the Vernon marriage. Her voice quivering, Jenny told Will that she could no longer work for him. She asked to be reassigned. Every time Naomi Vernon saw Jenny and Will together, she was thrown into a panic. Naomi could see, just from the way that Jenny looked at Will, that she was in love with him, even if Jenny didn't know it herself. As the weeks passed, Jenny became more and more troubled by the fact that Will and Brad were both in love with her. Frightened to death that her continued presence might destroy the Vernon family, Jenny decided to go away to a retreat to seek spiritual guidance. While she was away, Naomi embarked upon a desperate plan designed to get Will to come back to her. She attempted suicide by swallowing an overdose of barbiturates, but never intended to die. Naomi had every intention of having Brad find her in time, but Brad, never dreaming what his mother was up to, was busy two-timing Jenny again with Lana McLean. While Brad seduced Lana, his mother overdosed and died. Naomi's death destroyed the Vernon family. Overcome with guilt, during the summer of 1978, Vicky suddenly found herself faced with the formidable task of raising a teenager. Upon the death of her mother, Irene, Vicky's goddaughter, Tina Clayton, came to Llanview and quickly became an innocent pawn in Mark O'Dane's evil blackmail scheme. Jenny decided that she would no longer see Brad or Will. In the aftermath of his mother's death and Jenny's rejection, a tortured Brad began to fall apart. He turned to Lana McLean for comfort and led the naive girl to believe that he loved her. Even after Brad managed to reconcile with Jenny, he continued to see Lana on the side. Meanwhile, Jenny could see that Will was still in love with her. She decided that the only way to free herself of the overwhelming guilt was to marry Brad. Her decision to marry him astonished Brad, who was about to receive an even bigger shock. Lana was pregnant with his child. The news panicked Brad, who tried everything in his power to convince Lana to have an abortion. With Jenny and Brad's wedding rapidly approaching, Lana sank into a state of deep depression, numbing her pain with liquor and pills. Terrified that she would spoil his wedding, Brad went to see Lana. He froze upon learning from a blindly drunk Lana that she intended to deliver a letter to Jenny the next day, the day of the wedding. She had, prior to Brad's arrival, made herself some hot milk, into which she had dissolved 2 sleeping pills. In a panic, Brad began searching Lana's apartment for the letter. When Lana became agitated, he gave her the milk, unaware it contained a deadly dose of drugs. Brad found the letter and destroyed it. In a move intended to pacify Lana, he gave her his mother's ring, telling her it could be redeemed for a lot of money. As Lana fell asleep, Brad retrieved an airline ticket and cash he had given her in the hope that she would leave town. Just as he was about to leave, Brad became aware that Lana wasn't moving. When he tried to rouse her, he discovered to his horror that she was dead. In total panic now, Brad wiped the place clean of fingerprints and rushed out, spending the rest of the evening setting up an alibi for himself. He managed to convince his teenage sister, Samantha, to lie for him. And at the inquest, she testified that Brad spent the night with her. Also, during the inquest, Mark O'Dane, who had visited Lana earlier in the evening, tried to implicate Brad. Still, Jenny maintained complete faith in her fiancé, and to prove it, she asked Brad to marry her immediately. Then Jenny took the stand and sent everyone in the courtroom, especially Will, into shock by announcing that she and Brad were man and wife. The police, led by Lieutenant Hall, suspected that there was foul play in Lana's death, but were unable to prove it. Brad was exonerated of any wrongdoing. During the winter of 1978, Pat Kendall decided the time was right to tell her son Brian that Tony Lord was his natural father. With her husband Paul's approval, Pat sat Brian down in the Kendall living room and with great sensitivity broke the news. Still, Brian took the news badly. He lashed out at his mother. How could Tony be his father? He hated Tony. Blinded by tears, he raced out the door and into the street. At that very moment, Karen Wolek was a passenger in a car driven by her favorite patron, Talbot Huddleston. In the midst of an argument with Karen, Talbot did not see the boy crossing his path. The car struck and killed Brian instantly. To avoid scandal, Huddleston sped away from the accident scene. The relationship between Tony and Pat deteriorated quickly in the weeks after their son's death. They attempted to communicate, but the old wounds between them had reopened. Paul proved to be a source of strength to Pat during the difficult early weeks of 1978. He gently helped her come out of her shell. She, too, provided support to Paul when two former radical underground enemies, Bonnie Harmer and Herman Cantrell, escaped from federal prison and showed up in Landview intent on executing the man whose testimony had put them behind bars. In a showdown, Paul was shot, and Jim Craig, Joe Riley, and Jenny Vernon were held hostage in the hospital before the criminals were apprehended and sent back to jail. Brad went through hell knowing that Jenny could have died in the hostage siege. The crisis made him realize, for the first time, how much he truly loved Jenny. In a moving moment with his father, Will, Brad vowed that if Jenny survived the ordeal, he would make a clean breast of it and confess all his transgressions, beginning with the biggest secret of all, the fact that he was present in Lana's apartment on the night she died. When Jenny was safely returned, Brad stayed true to his word and made a full confession of his sins to a stunned Jenny. Jenny realized that her whole marriage to Brad was based on a lie. Despite Brad's promises to live the straight life from now on, Jenny decided their marriage was over. In desperation, Brad made one final grandstand play designed to elicit Jenny's sympathy and force her to change her mind. After checking with a lawyer and learning that if he went to the authorities and came clean, he could get off with a very light sentence, Brad turned himself in and was given a 3-month jail sentence. On his last day of freedom, Brad made one final plea for Jenny to hold off on the annulment until after he served his time. Jenny went on a retreat to ponder Brad's seemingly sincere request. After serving his 3-month prison sentence, Brad Vernon came home to learn that Jenny was sticking to her decision to obtain a papal annulment from the church. Brad, now more embittered than ever, was determined to get even with her in any way he could. Soon after his release, he got a job as an all-around flunky for a newcomer, the mysterious millionaire Adam Brewster. Brad's younger sister, Samantha, developed a teenage crush on an older man, Tony Lord. Realizing that Sam was becoming emotionally attached to him, Tony gently but straight out told her that he didn't love her as she loved him. Deeply hurt by Tony's rejection, Samantha ran from Tony's place in tears. Dr. Pamela Shepard, Will Vernon's new fiancée, followed Samantha into her car and tried to calm her down. Sam drove off with Pam in the car and had a terrible accident. Pam died in the crash, and Sam suffered severe facial burns that left her with the possibility of disfigurement. Guilt-ridden, Tony presented Sam with an engagement ring and prepared to marry her, regardless of how her facial surgery turned out. Jenny's heart went out to Brad in the days after Samantha's tragic accident. Ever compassionate and giving, Jenny offered Brad the comfort he so desperately needed. Once again, Jenny returned to this man who had brought her so much pain. After divorcing Paul Kendall, Pat resolved to start her life over. Reverting to her maiden name, Ashley, she poured her energies into her new TV talk show on Landview's local station, WWVLE-TV. She was flattered by the attention paid to her by millionaire Adam Brewster, who hid from Pat the fact that he suffered dangerous epileptic seizures. Only Adam's faithful assistant, Gretel Cummings, was aware of the serious nature of his illness. Snobby and ambitious Edwina Lewis, a new writer working for Dorian's Lord Press, came to Landview and set her sights on Becky Lee Hunt's man, the wealthy Richard Abbott. Despite Edwina's seductive efforts, Richard asked Becky to marry him. Faced with losing Richard, Edwina took off for North Carolina to do a little digging into Becky's past. There she learned that Becky's real name was Jackson, not Hunt. What could she be hiding? Back home in Llanview, Richard received a tantalizing offer from the Banner's editor, Joe Riley, to head up the newspaper's European bureau. Just as Richard and Becky were about to leave for Europe, a redneck named Luke Jackson showed up in Llanview. Luke was Becky Lee's husband. Edwina viewed Luke's presence as a godsend. He was the one way that she could keep Richard from leaving Llanview. One night, Luke brutally beat Richard, leaving him with a fractured skull. Luke was apprehended and sent to jail, but before long he escaped and plotted to get his final revenge on Becky Lee for leaving him. In the resulting shootout, Ed Hall was hit and rushed to Llanview Hospital, where he was operated on by Dr. Jack Scott. Dr. Scott performed a delicate operation to remove a bullet lodged near Ed's heart. Carla was grateful to the gruff, no-nonsense Dr. Scott, who began to show more than a passing interest in Ed's wife. Within weeks, Ed was out of the hospital and on the road to recovery. Carla began spending more and more time at the hospital with Jack, her new boss. Sitting at her desk during the day, she tried to shake off the fantasies she was having about her handsome employer. Their simmering relationship reached an important turning point when Jack asked Carla to accompany him to a medical convention in the Virgin Islands. Ed, who was obviously jealous, opposed the idea. Carla, believing that it was important that she go for professional reasons, left with Jack. However, when they reached the Caribbean, the physical attraction that had long been brewing between them finally came into the open. When Jack kissed Carla, she responded. In the aftermath, Carla was devastated and guilt-ridden. Rushing back to Llanview and Ed, Carla had an immediate meeting with Chief of Staff Jim Craig and requested that she be allowed to quit her job with Jack and go to work for Larry. However, a simple change of jobs did not mean she could stop thinking of and fantasizing about Jack Scott. Ed, back at work, began to sense that his wife was pulling away from him. In the aftermath of the near tragedy with Luke Jackson, Becky and Richard married in a loving ceremony held at Joe and Vicky's carriage house. Following the wedding, they left Llanview for a fresh start in Europe. Dorian Lord proved that she was as mean-spirited as ever when her sister Melinda returned after having spent several years in a mental institution. When Dorian noticed that Melinda and Dr. Peter Jansen were gravitating toward each other, she immediately took steps to undermine their relationship. Dorian wanted Peter all for herself. In the past, Melinda would have succumbed to Dorian's evil schemes, but Melinda was healthy now, and feisty too. She stood up to her hated older sister and gave Dorian the comeuppance she had so long deserved. A defeated Dorian could do nothing as Melinda and Peter eloped. Sadly, soon after the marriage, signs of Melinda's disturbed behavior returned. Believing that she must prove herself to Peter so that he would have the same respect for her that he had for Jenny, Melinda decided to resume her career as a concert pianist. Practicing day and night, she nearly drove Peter insane with her compulsive playing. Her hopes were dashed when, in her big audition, she failed to impress the world-famous Bruno Weston. Melinda lied to Peter, and Marco Dane discovered the charade and threatened to expose her. The blackmailing of Melinda was just one of many nefarious Marco Dane schemes perpetrated on the citizens of Llanview in 1978. Having discovered Karen's afternoon romps with married men, who in return showered her with lavish gifts, Marco wanted a piece of the action. He forced Karen into becoming one of his freelance hookers. Although she at first refused his demands, Karen was forced to accept when Marco threatened to spill the beans to her husband Larry. Karen no longer enjoyed her love in the afternoon. She reluctantly slept with various men, paid Marco his cut, and prayed that her upstanding husband would never discover her dreadful secret. During this time, Vicky's lifestyle changed dramatically when her childhood friend Irene Clayton returned to town to tell Vicky that she was dying. Irene asked Vicky to take care of her 16-year-old daughter, Tina. When Irene died, Tina arrived, and suddenly Vicky was facing the daunting challenge of raising a teenager. One day, Vicky was surprised to see Marco Dane and Karen Wolick together in the lobby of the seedy Wallington Hotel. She confronted Karen, who broke down and admitted the truth. She was a hooker. Believing that Karen was sincere in wanting to quit the life and be a good mother to Danny and wife to Larry, Vicky confronted Marco and threatened to ruin him if he didn't leave Karen alone. Marco bowed to Vicky's threats, but vowed to somehow get even with her someday. Before long, he had found the instrument to even the score, Tina. Over the summer of 1978, Marco opened a local modeling agency and slowly and carefully won the confidence of sweet and innocent Tina Clayton, who was working at a local pizza parlor and seeing a nice boy named Greg Huddleston. Greg's father was Talbot Huddleston, Karen's lecherous first John. Marco hatched his scheme. He plotted to take modeling photographs of Tina and superimpose those shots over the nude body of another model. To get even with Vicky, Marco would show the world that Tina was a pornographic model. Greg Huddleston, sensing Tina's attraction to the slimy Marco, ordered him to stay away from his girlfriend, or Greg would kill him. Greg's father, Talbot, also ordered Dane to back off from Tina, or pay the price. As Marco carried out his insidious scheme, he never dreamed he would come to like Tina himself. Feeling sorry for the sweet girl, Marco abandoned his dummied photograph scheme and instead began to gaslight Vicky into thinking that her split personality, Nikki Smith, had returned. One day, Vicky again confronted Marco about his role in Tina's life. Wanting to get Vicky off his back, Marco countered by showing the nude photographs of Tina to her. Marco threatened to circulate the scandalous photos unless Vicky paid him off. After anguishing for days, Vicky went to Marco's health club with $50,000, though she was determined not to hand it over to him. To her shock, Vicky found Marco's dead body. Thinking fast, she took Tina's photos from the file cabinet and hurried out. For a time, Greg Huddleston was held in custody as the prime suspect in Marco's murder. But when the police learned that the murder weapon was pawned by one Nikki Smith, Greg was released, and Joe, aware now that the circle was closing around Vicky, went to Pine Valley, home of ABC's All My Children, to retain the services of attorney Paul Martin. By the end of 1978, both Joe Riley and Paul Martin feared that an indictment against Vicky was only a matter of time. Karen was finally free of Marco. At home, her life with Larry, now chief of staff at Landview Hospital, was never better. Furthermore, Karen knew that her friend, hooker Katrina Carr, had seen Marco the day he died. Could she have killed Marco Dane? Karen's greatest fear was that Vicky would be blamed for something that Katrina actually had done. In October, Vicky Riley kept vigil at her beloved Joe's bedside as he peacefully passed away. 1979 began on a horrifying note for Vicky Riley when a grand jury handed down an indictment against her for the murder of Marco Dane. Attorney Paul Martin entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf, and Landview's most sensational murder trial began in early February. Anxious to help Vicky in any way she could, Karen Wolick searched day and night for her hooker friend Katrina Carr, whom she believed knew who killed Marco. Unfortunately, Karen made the mistake of telling this to Talbot Huddleston. Talbot feigned great concern that Vicky Riley might be suffering an injustice. However, his real concern was that Katrina Carr might have seen him commit the crime. Talbot Huddleston killed Marco Dane. Vicky's trial began in February, and from the outset, the prospect of acquittal looked bleak, primarily because of her desire to protect Tina. The prosecution, led by Landview's brilliant DA, Herb Callison, built a strong case against Vicky. After a month of damaging testimony, Callison dropped the biggest bombshell of all into the proceedings by calling a surprise witness, Marco Dane's twin brother, Dr. Mario Corelli. Dr. Corelli, who practiced medicine in Colorado, introduced damaging letters Marco had written to him about how Vicky had threatened him. The trial of Vicky Riley reached a thrilling climax when Karen Wolek took the stand for the defense. Karen had finally found her old friend from the life, Katrina Carr. In exchange for money she needed for drugs, Katrina gave Karen the combination to a post office box, which Katrina claimed contained information revealing the identity of Marco Dane's killer. When Karen went to the post office to get the information, she discovered to her horror that Talbot Huddleston had beaten her to it. To further complicate matters, Karen learned that the previous night Katrina had been run down by a car and was now lying comatose in Llanview Hospital. Karen correctly guessed that Talbot was the killer and prepared to break the news in court. But when Karen took the stand, she was savagely cross-examined by D.A. Callison, who forced her to reveal the whole sordid truth of her life as a hooker. Larry listened in stunned silence as his wife revealed that she had been turning tricks when he thought she was at home. Later that day, word came from the hospital that Katrina had come out of her coma and named Talbot as the killer. This revelation was enough to exonerate Vicky, but for Karen the damage had been done. The whole world now knew of her secret life as a hooker, and her marriage to Larry appeared to be doomed. In the weeks after Karen's painful confession, Dr. Larry Wolek discovered that there were those, Dorian and her allies, who would visit his wife's sins upon him. Dorian led a vicious campaign to have Larry ousted as chief of staff of Llanview Hospital. At long last, Dorian felt she had a way to even her score with Larry and his dear friend, Vicky. As Larry's replacement, Dorian ordained her old friend and mentor, Dr. Ivan Kipling, a move that the ambitious and cutthroat Dr. Kipling strongly favored. Karen also encountered severe difficulties finding a job. In despair, she nearly returned to the street again. Ironically, it was Dr. Mario Corelli who dissuaded her from going back to the life. Karen's fortunes took a turn for the better when, after several weeks of separation, Larry decided to make a last attempt to salvage their marriage. However, word that a Larry-Karen reconciliation was in the works quickly spread to Dorian, who used it to revive her endless vendetta against Larry. At Dorian's urging, the hospital board voted to ask Larry for his resignation. Larry decided to fight the board's decision, but Dorian's actions succeeded in making Karen come to the conclusion that she would always be Larry's albatross. Joe Riley could not believe his ears when Vicky broke the news that she was pregnant with their second child. Sadly, Joe passed away before his wife gave birth to their son, Joey. With great sadness, Karen decided to divorce Larry, who found comfort with Faith Kipling, the warm-hearted wife of the cold-blooded Llanview Hospital doctor, Ivan Kipling. Faith was every bit as sweet as Ivan was sour, and she and Larry and his son Danny struck up a special bond. Dr. Mario Corelli settled in Llanview, where he devoted hours to his new job at the Llanview Hospital Free Clinic. In time, Karen discovered an amazing truth. Mario was really Marco Dane. He wasn't dead after all. Karen forced Marco to tell what really happened on December 15, 1978, the night he was supposedly murdered. It seemed that Marco had returned to his health club and was horrified to discover the dead body is his brother Mario. He then made the instant decision to exchange identities with the corpse. Marco implored Karen to keep his secret, telling her that he'd been born again. After considerable soul-searching, Karen decided to protect Marco on one condition: that he immediately stop practicing medicine. Marco had no choice but to agree to her terms. The one bright spot in Karen's life was her sister, Jenny. She was delighted to be pregnant with Brad's baby. Unbeknownst to Jenny, though, Brad was back on the road to ruin. This time, he had developed a compulsion for gambling. With his losses mounting, Brad resorted to desperate measures by stealing Jenny's key to the hospital's pharmacy and giving it to a mobster named Brick. In exchange, Brick agreed to wipe out Brad's debts. When Brick and an accomplice tried to rob the pharmacy, they were caught by Dr. Jack Scott, who was shot and paralyzed in the violent exchange. The shooting of Jack Scott represented another major step in the volatile marriage of Ed and Carla Hall. Prior to the shooting, Ed had decided he'd had it with Carla's vacillation over Jack. Asking Carla for a divorce, Ed moved into Ena Hopkins' boarding house. When Jack was hospitalized, Carla was finally able to articulate her love for him. Upon his recovery, Carla was more than a little shocked when Jack told her that he had no intentions of marrying her. It seemed that he was more interested in an affair than in marriage. However, Jack finally decided that he was too much in love to lose Carla. In the fall of 1979, Carla married Jack in what marked a low point in Ed Hall's life. Fortunately, Ed was able to rely on the friendship of soulmates Katrina Carr and Karen Wolick during this difficult time. The marriage of Carla and Jack did not last long. Realizing that he was a scoundrel, Carla divorced Dr. Scott and eventually left Landview to study law. Karen Wolick grew deeply concerned about her sister's pregnancy. Complications forced Jenny to check into the hospital for several weeks. Feeling guilty that Brad was home alone without her, Jenny asked Karen to look after him. Karen knew that Brad had no love for her, but whatever Jenny wanted, Karen would do. Brad and Karen clashed at first, but eventually Brad became fascinated by his sexy sister-in-law. The fascination grew into obsession. One night, Brad tried to seduce Karen. When he got physical, Karen put up a struggle and Brad became enraged. What began as seduction suddenly turned to rape. In the aftermath of the rape, Karen was left in a state of trauma and outrage. Brad ordered her to keep her mouth shut, and the device he used to keep Karen quiet was Jenny's well-being. Karen knew she couldn't reveal a word about the rape, because if Jenny were to find out, it would all but destroy her. Mired in guilt and depression, Karen agreed to Brad's demands. But Larry began his own detective work, trying to discover the cause of his wife's distress, which led him to the realization that Brad raped Karen. In a rage, Larry beat Brad to a pulp. The news spread quickly, and it was only a matter of time before Jenny put all the pieces together and finally arrived at the whole horrible truth herself. Jenny threw Brad out of their apartment, telling him that she never wanted to see him again. In court, a dejected Brad Vernon agreed to a plea bargain. For the lesser charge of assault, he was sentenced to 3 months in prison. The gruesome revelation that Brad raped Karen proved to be traumatic for Jenny, leading to the premature birth of her tiny baby by cesarean section. When Karen and Marco visited the nursery where Jenny's baby lay next to Katrina Carr's newborn, something terrible happened. Jenny's baby suddenly went into cardiac arrest and died before their eyes. In a panic, Karen came up with an incredible plan. They would switch babies. Marco argued that it would be wrong and insane to do such a thing. However, when a grim Karen told him that switching the babies was the price she asked for silence about his own switched identity, Marco relented and did the deed. Katrina fell into a deep depression when she was told that her baby died. Jenny took baby Mary home, never suspecting that the precious little girl belonged to another woman. As for Karen and Marco, they felt sever pangs of guilt about their deed, but neither was aware that Katrina's sense of loss would one day haunt them all. Dorian's sister Melinda sank deeper into psychosis in 1979. When her paranoia reached new heights, she checked herself into the Compton Clinic. Before leaving Landview, Melinda begged Peter to wait until she was mentally healthy again and could return to him. Peter agreed, though he was clearly falling in love with Jenny Vernon. Jenny's sister-in-law, Samantha Vernon, was overwhelmed when Tony Lord proposed marriage to her. However, she came to realize that Tony had only agreed to marry her out of guilt over her near-fatal car accident, and at the last moment, she called off the ceremony. Pat Ashley finally discovered what her lover, Adam Brewster, tried to hide, the fact that he suffered from a severe case of epilepsy. With the secret out in the open, Pat married Adam, unaware that he was concealing another heinous secret from her. Adam, who was broke, masterminded, with Dorian's financial backing, a shady arms deal with the notorious Torrentino regime in war-torn San Carlos. When Pat discovered that Adam had put all moral considerations aside in order to get his financial empire back in order, she quickly had their new marriage annulled. For comfort, Pat turned to her TV producer, Dick Grant. In Pat's presence, Dick was a cheerful, charming, very outgoing gentleman. However, he had developed a psychotic crush on her. When Samantha Vernon discovered that Dick had transformed his tiny apartment into a photo-covered shrine to Pat, he kidnapped her, then Pat, before the police apprehended him. In the aftermath of the near tragedy, Samantha turned to Jim Craig's nephew, Mick Gordon, a world champion speed skater, who had his heart set on winning a gold medal in the 1980 Olympics. However, Mick's hopes were dashed when he broke his legs in a tragic small plane crash. Mick's overbearing mother, Fran, blamed Samantha for shattering her son's Olympic dreams, and she was willing to go to any lengths to keep Mick and Sam's love from being consummated. In the fall of 1979, Pat's look-alike sister, Maggie Ashley, arrived from England. Though she appeared to be polite and shy, it became apparent that Maggie harbored a deep resentment for her pretty blonde sister. Vicki Riley received some joyous news when she discovered she was pregnant with her second child. The only source of consternation in Vicki's life was provided by her ward, Tina. Having been spurned by Mario Corelli, Tina had taken up with a rather undesirable young crowd, which included an unsavory motorcyclist named Judd. In the fall, Vicki's husband, Joe, began suffering severe headaches and dizzy spells, all the classic signs of a recurrence of the brain tumor that had nearly killed him several years earlier when Joe learned from his doctors, Jim Craig and Ivan Kipling, that he had only a few weeks left. He faced his fate with the same stoic courage he had shown previously. Over Jim's objections, Joe elected not to break the news to Vicki until he had gotten all his affairs in order. Knowing he had precious little time left, Joe treated Vicki to a wonderful wedding anniversary. Together, they celebrated their son Kevin's 3rd birthday. Though Joe tried his best to hide his illness, Vicki began to be aware of his headaches and became increasingly concerned about him. With time running out, Joe handpicked his successor as editor of the Banner. He sent for the editor of a small but prestigious newspaper in Arizona, Clint Buchanan. Joe ultimately had no choice but to break the news of his impending death to Vicki, who went into deep shock. As his days dwindled down to a precious few, Joe did everything within his power to shower love upon his one and only true love, Vicki. Joe beseeched Vicki to move on with her life after he was gone. He urged her to find someone else, someone to love who would love her in return. On the afternoon of Wednesday, October 3rd, 1979, Joseph Francis Riley died of a massive brain tumor. Vicki courageously accepted Joe's death, as he would have wanted. She poured her energies into working with Clint at the Banner and fending off a takeover attempt by her arch-rival, Dorian Lord. Clint braced himself for the arrival of his Texas family. An entourage of friends and relatives arrived, including his father Asa's girlfriend, Mimi King, his right-hand man, Chuck Wilson, nephew Rafe Garrettson, and country singer Johnny Drummond. The one face Clint was happy to see was his high-strung younger brother, Bo, who had been browbeaten by his domineering father, but not Asa. Clint had been estranged from his pa for years and was clearly agitated at the prospect of Asa Buchanan's imminent arrival. Quickly, Clint understood that Bo had been sent on a mission by Asa to get Clint to return to the family fold. Clint dated both Pat and Maggie Ashley, but only found himself interested in Pat. Maggie made a play for Clint, who rebuffed her. However, Pat, unwilling to hurt her sister any more than Clint already had, refused to have anything to do with him. As the year came to an end, Maggie hatched a plan to steal Pat's identity. By impersonating Pat, Maggie could have Clint all to herself. Homesick for his native Texas, millionaire Asa Buchanan bought a massive estate Southampton, and turned it into a little bit of the Lone Star State. Here, Asa corralled his sons, Bo and Clint, and right-hand man Chuck Wilson, at his birthday bash for soon-to-be ex-girlfriend Mimi King and future wife Samantha Vernon. Removing her glasses and donning a blonde wig, Maggie Ashley transformed herself into the spitting image of her sister, Pat. No one could tell that she had stolen her sister's identity. She no longer had to settle for being jealous of Pat's poise, Pat's success, and Pat's way with men. Maggie could be Pat. After locking Pat in a cellar, Maggie began living a double life as her own sister. At first, Clint Buchanan was fooled by Maggie's charade. However, she began making mistakes that aroused Clint's suspicions that something was awry. With the help of Banner aide Matt McAllister, Clint began to piece the horror story together. The woman he was romancing wasn't Pat Ashley. Clint raced to Pat's house, where Maggie was just about to shoot her sister. Clint froze momentarily upon hearing a single gunshot from within. He broke into the house to find Maggie dead and Pat standing over her with a revolver in her hand. Even though it was an obvious case of self-defense, Pat was so traumatized by her experiences that she could not even talk about the final moments of her sister's life. Haunted by Maggie's laughter, Pat withdrew further into herself. She broke up with Clint and found herself drawn to his younger brother, Bo, who had come to Landview as a representative of his famous father, oil baron Asa Buchanan. Dorian Lord was delighted by this turn of events. She set out to make Clint Buchanan fall in love with her, only to fail when he saw through her manipulative ways. Dorian did emerge with one small victory. During Pat's absence, Dorian had taken over her TV talk show and loved it. It took quite a bit of coaxing to get Dorian to relinquish the spotlight. When Pat Ashley entered his life, Bo Buchanan was in the midst of a torrid affair with his father's mistress, Mimi King. It was not a difficult conquest. Mimi, thinking her days with Asa were numbered, managed to seduce Bo. Richard Abbott returned to Landview with his new wife, Becky Lee, who had signed with the Buchanan Enterprises recording label. Becky was thrilled when the Buchanans booked her into the Grand Ole Opry. At the same time, she discovered that she was pregnant and could lose the baby if she encountered any undue stress. Driven by her childhood dream, Becky kept the news from Richard and went to Nashville, where her singing was a triumph. Later, backstage at the Opry, Becky collapsed and lost her baby. Although Richard's bitterness threatened the marriage, Clint managed to patch up the Abbotts, for the time being at least. In February 1980, Asa Buchanan finally blew into Landview for the first time and immediately assailed his son Bo for his incompetence. Almost immediately, Clint and Asa were at war. Asa hired young Samantha Vernon to work for him. Sam, who was living with Scatter Mick Gordon, became instantly enchanted with her new lifestyle, a world of money and, more importantly, power. Asa was equally impressed by Samantha, but he was more interested in her youth and her body than her business expertise. So captivated by Asa and his charisma, Sam did not see that her best friend, Tina Clayton, was seducing Mick. At the same time, Sexpot Tina was also waging a campaign to attract Bo's protege, country and western singer Johnny Drummond. When Samantha found out about Mick's affair with Tina, she threw him out of her loft, then threw herself into her work with Asa. He gave her a lavish 21st birthday bash in his mansion, Southampton. The party, complete with a rodeo, dancing girls, and a whole barbecued steer, climaxed with Asa, determined to maintain his youthful macho image, parachuting from a plane. Upon landing, Asa injured his knee and was flown to Landview Hospital for surgery. Bo flew to Paris to surprise Pat Ashley. When he checked into Pat's hotel, Bo was spotted by Pat's new friend, an elegant middle-aged woman, Nicole Bernard. When Nicole spotted Bo, she recognized him instantly. Bo was her son. Nicole Bernard was actually Asa's wife, Olympia Buchanan. Many years earlier, when Bo and Clint were children, Olympia had an affair with ranch hand Yancey Ralston and became pregnant. During an argument, Olympia killed Yancey. When Asa found out, he had Olympia banished to Europe, telling his children that their mother had died. Now, years later, Asa saw a photo of Nicole and Pat in Paris taken by Beau and went into a state of shock. If she were to resurface, he feared, Nicole could not only ruin his empire, but destroy his relationship with his sons and Samantha Vernon. Asa's fears were partially realized when Nicole told Pat that Beau is not a true Buchanan. Before Pat could find out what her cryptic comment meant, Nicole Bonnard was gone. To keep Nicole in check, Asa had her flown to Longueuil, where he imprisoned her in an eerie, dark mansion, Moorcliffe. Asa hired his nephew, Rafe Gerritsen, to watch over her, telling the naive young man that Nicole was insane. Troubled by Nicole's pleas for freedom, Rafe questioned the unusual circumstances, but was told by Asa's aide, Chuck Wilson, to do his job and trust his Uncle Asa. As Beau and Pat fell in love and got engaged, Asa did his darndest to break them up. Asa Buchanan hated strong, independent women like Pat Ashley so much that he forced his own mistress, Mimi King, to try and seduce Beau. She followed Beau to Nashville, where Becky Lee and Johnny Drummond were performing at the Grand Ole Opry, and attempted, unsuccessfully, to lure him into bed. As the year went on, the relationship between Beau and Asa grew more bitter and competitive, until Beau finally opted to leave the family fold and start his own company, Lone Star Records. Beau was determined to beat his daddy at his own game. During this period, the father that Tina had never known, Ted Clayton, arrived in Llanview intent on reconciling with his daughter. However, Ted wasn't Ted at all. He was Tom Clarkson, a recently released inmate who was about to try and con Vicky out of her fortune and Tina out of her inheritance. Suave. Ted made himself indispensable to the widow Riley, who had just given birth to her second son, Joseph Francis. In her arms, Vicky held proof of her and Joe's great love. Sadly, there was no Joe to walk in the room to share her joy. Ted Clayton was determined to fill that void in Vicky's life. He set out to get control of her emotions and her money. Before long, Ted pitted himself against Clint Buchanan, who had taken more than a professional interest in Vicky, his publisher at the Banner. When Ted learned that Clint was about to propose marriage to Vicky, he stepped up his plan by masterminding the kidnapping of Tina. His goal was not only to get his hands on the ransom, but to make himself indispensable to Vicky. When Tina was safely returned home, Ted proposed marriage to Vicky. Flustered but touched by his request, Vicky opted for time to consider the offer. Karen Wolek grew nervous every time Katrina Carr visited Jenny and her baby girl Mary. By now, Katrina had begun dating a handsome beer truck driver, Marcello Salta, who made her see that she was a wonderful, worthy person. As for Jenny, with Brad finally out of her life, he was serving time in Statesville prison for raping Karen. She turned to her friends for support. Most of all, she found herself drawn to Dr. Peter Jansen. In the spring, Jenny and Peter declared their love for each other, but they faced an uphill battle. Peter needed a divorce, and his wife Melinda, whom Dorian had declared mentally incompetent, was not about to give him one. Also, Jenny was determined to remain true to her marriage vows and not sleep with Peter until she obtained an annulment from Brad. When baby Mary became ill with a minor blood disease and needed a transfusion, Peter realized from her blood type that Jenny could not be her mother. One look at the footprints and Peter saw that Mary Vernon was Katrina's baby, not Jenny's. Karen had switched babies. Tormented by his discovery, Peter promised Karen that he would not reveal the truth to Jenny. Marco Dane was finding it harder and harder to impersonate his dead brother Mario Corelli, especially after falling in love with Edwina Lewis. Edwina demanded total honesty, which Marco simply couldn't provide. At the same time, he was having a tough time fending off Dorian Lord's attempts to prove that Mario was really Marco. When the stress of leading dual lives proved too much, Marco developed selective amnesia. To her horror, Karen Wallach witnessed cool and calm Mario turn into wild-eyed Marco and not turn back. Karen hid her Jekyll and Hyde pal in a sleazy motel, then had him committed to a sanitarium. Mario's dependence upon Karen made Larry jealous. As the gap in their relationship widened once again, Larry turned to Ivan Kipling's estranged wife, Faith, for companionship. Karen, who still loved Larry with all her heart, grew jealous of his friendship with Faith Kipling. Ivan was a brilliant brain surgeon with a host of secrets. Among them was the fact that he was the natural father of Edwina Lewis, who despised him. Kipling. When Dorian saw an opportunity to become Pennsylvania's new First Lady, she grabbed it. In 1980, Ms. Lord romantically wooed Landview's ambitious DA Herb Callison while skillfully steering his successful campaign for governor. Herb won, but was forced to resign when it was uncovered that he and Dorian had engaged in illegal campaign activity. Also had a very secret, very personal fetish. He liked to frequent prostitutes and dress them in sexy lingerie before having sex with them. Ivan shuddered when he saw Karen Volek for the first time. She had been one of his hookers and could expose his perverted obsession. Determined to protect his secret, Ivan set a trap for Karen, asking her to meet him in a deserted building. Kipling intended to kill her. In the ensuing struggle, Karen took a terrible tumble down a flight of stairs. Just as Ivan was about to finish her off, two vagrants entered the building, forcing him to flee. Karen was rushed to the hospital in a coma. Ivan, as chief neurosurgeon, was put in charge of her case. He called for immediate surgery where he planned to kill her, this time for sure. The moment arrived when Ivan decided to make the fatal mistake that would end her life. He changed his mind. His pride in his profession and his devotion to the Hippocratic Oath prevented him from killing Karen on the operating table. In the aftermath of the surgery, Ivan injected Karen with drugs to keep her silent for as long as possible. Reconciling with his wife, he coerced Faith into becoming his accomplice. They injected a drug into Karen's IV that would cause her respiratory system to collapse. In 30 minutes, Karen Volek would be dead. However, Jenny's prompt action saved her sister, and the Kiplings managed to elude the authorities and escape to South America. Marco decided that the only way to avoid going crazy was to marry Edwina and leave town for good. Once he and Edwina left Landview, thought Marco, he could live a stress-free, peaceful life as Mario Corelli. The Corelli-Lewis wedding promised to end tensions that had been building since Mario's attacks began. Karen, who was enjoying some rare happiness with Larry, would finally be free of the man who had given her so much grief over the years. On the morning of the wedding, Dorian was more convinced than ever that Mario was an imposter. She took evidence to Edwina's apartment, determined to save her friend from making a terrible mistake. Edwina refused to listen to her or to even look at Dorian's so-called evidence. Determined not to let Marco Dane escape, Dorian pulled enough strings to get an indictment against him, and he was arrested in his wedding suit just before the marriage took place and was charged with impersonating a doctor. Edwina, in a state of shock, broke all ties with Marco. He went to jail, refusing to even see Karen, hoping to weaken the suspicion that she was his co-conspirator. Of course, Larry knew enough to assume that Karen had to have aided and abetted Marco. When questioned, Karen told Larry the truth. She knew that she had violated not only her promise of honesty, but also Larry's own morality and his ethics as a doctor. Larry, caught between his love for Karen and his duty, asked Karen for time to let them both consider what had happened. The following day, Karen, guilt-ridden and not wanting to hurt Larry and his son Danny anymore, packed her bags and moved into Ina Hopkins's boarding house. Eventually, Marco and Edwina reconciled and married in a touching private ceremony. After her breakup with Clint Buchanan, Dorian sank her claws into Landview's ambitious DA, Herb Callison. With Dorian's guidance and financial support, Herb won a close election for governor in the fall. Unbeknownst to him, Dorian had obtained a huge illegal campaign contribution from Asa Buchanan in exchange for his winning a state highway contract from the new governor. Unfortunately, Herb had promised the same highway deal to a local mobster, Erwin Kieser. It was only a matter of time before news of these dishonest maneuvers began to leak to the press. At year's end, Dorian made final plans to become the First Lady of Pennsylvania, just as whispers of scandal were heard in the inner circles of Llanview. When counterfeiter Ted Clayton put out a contract to kill Marco Dane and Karen Wolick, the dynamic duo narrowly avoided death by jumping onto a moving train to elude the hitman. Karen escaped the ordeal unscathed, but Marco was less fortunate, having sustained a bullet wound to the arm. Dorian Lord was too involved with her wedding plans to do more than deny the rumor that her intended husband, Governor Herb Callison, had received illegal campaign contributions from millionaire Asa Buchanan. On the day of the wedding, the newly elected Lieutenant Governor Ed Hall, convinced of Herb and Dorian's guilt, faced his conscience and resigned from office. Dorian immediately did her best to shore up Herb's backbone. She refused to let him resign in disgrace. However, with the evidence mounting against him, Herb had no choice but to relinquish the governorship. Dorian's dream and Herb's career collapsed. In disgrace, Herb Callison took a lowly position as public defender. During this trying period, Dorian discovered that she needed her sister Melinda as much as Melinda had always needed her. Nevertheless, Melinda was on her way back to the Compton Clinic after having threatened Jenny Vernon with a letter opener. Her insane act meant further postponement of Jenny and Peter's wedding. A dejected Peter realized that he could never get a divorce from Melinda until she was mentally fit. On her last night in Llanview, Melinda overheard a secret conversation between Peter, Marco, and Karen that would send her further into madness. Melinda heard them talking about the notorious baby switch, in which Marco and Karen switched Jenny's dead baby with Katrina's little girl. Pat Ashley had to wonder what had happened to Nicole Bonard, the friend she'd met in Paris. She kept remembering Nicole's final cryptic words to her that Beau was not a true Buchanan. Where could she be? Pat hired Ed Hall, now a private detective, to help her find her missing friend. Asa was holding Nicole, who in truth was Asa's first wife, Olympia, in Moorcliffe, the estate next to Lanfair. During the early weeks of 1981, Asa finally got young Samantha Vernon to agree to marry him. At the same time, Asa's nephew, Rafe, developed a genuine fascination for Sam, who had no idea that the handsome young man she visited Moorcliffe was a Buchanan. As Asa and Sam prepared to marry, Nicole escaped from her makeshift prison and plunged a knife into Asa's shoulder. The knifing did not seriously injure Asa, who quickly fabricated a story to explain his injury. On Asa's wedding day, Nicole escaped again, bought a gun, and hid in the church as the guests arrived. With gun in hand, Nicole prepared to stop the wedding. However, at the last second, Rafe appeared and silently subdued the raving woman. With Chuck Wilson's assistance, Rafe dragged Nicole out of the church and back to Moorcliffe. The wedding continued without incident. However, all hell broke loose at the reception when Becky Lee's ex-husband, Luther Jackson, crashed the festivities. Drunk and hostile, he blamed Sam for destroying his marriage to Becky, then pointed a gun at Asa. In the ensuing struggle, a shot rang out, striking Dr. Peter Jansen, who was rushed to Llanview Hospital for emergency surgery. As the days passed, Peter's condition worsened and, fearing he would die, he wanted to confess his part as conspirator in the baby switch. Karen convinced Peter to confess to a priest. Suspicious of Peter's actions, Brad secretly placed a voice-activated tape recorder in Peter's hospital room and learned the startling truth that Marco and Karen had switched Jenny's dead baby with Katrina's healthy child in the hospital nursery. Armed with the news, Brad threatened to tell Jenny, but found that he could not hurt the woman he still loved with this dreadful secret. Even on Jenny and Peter's wedding day, Brad could not bring himself to stop the ceremony. With Karen as maid of honor and Larry as best man, Jenny Vernon became Mrs. Peter Jansen. Katrina, whose engagement to Marcello Salta came unglued when he discovered on the eve of their wedding that she had once been a hooker, comforted Brad. Katrina revealed to him that she suspected that he was the father of her dead baby, the result of an evening they'd spent together at the Wellington Hotel nearly 3 years earlier. Becky Lee and Richard's marriage fell apart in 1981 when Becky Lee realized that she loved her singing partner, Johnny Drummond. Richard left town, and Johnny left his new flame Tina in the dust and hurried into a romance with Becky Lee. The Ted-Vicky-Clint triangle lost aside when Clint decided not to pursue a relationship with Vicky. Clint sensed, correctly, that Ted Clayton was duping Vicky. Despite Clint's words of warning, Vicky was happy with Ted, blissfully unaware that he was actually the head of a counterfeit ring centered in Llanview. Detective Vince Wolek, hot on the trail of the ringleader, paid a terrible price upon discovering that Ted was a counterfeiter. To silence Vince, Ted administered a poison through a ring on his finger. The deadly dose took an hour to work. Vince, not knowing he was dying, came to Karen and his wife, Wanda, then collapsed. His last words were, "Tell Vicky." Before he could finish the sentence, Vince died. Doctors ruled that a heart attack caused his sudden death. The untimely death of the affable Vince Wolek deeply affected the people of Llanview. Vicky was extremely upset, though Ted did his best to comfort her. Anna and Jim Craig tried to console Wanda in her time of grief. In mourning, Wanda devoted her energies to Llanview West, her new country and western nightclub. In a moving memorial service, Larry paid tribute to the brother who was responsible for him becoming a doctor. More than almost anyone, Karen felt the pain of Vince's death. If she had gone with Vince on the night of his death as he had wanted, he might still be alive. Determined to befriend Steve Piermont, a member of the counterfeiting ring who she knew could lead her to his boss, Karen pretended to return to hooking. Within days of Vince's death, Karen was prowling the Wallington Hotel, scene of so much heartache in the past, insisting to all that she was back in the life. Larry, who was now showering his kindness and honesty upon Asa's much-maligned former mistress, Mimi King, was one of many who was skeptical of Karen's sudden regression. Suspicious of Karen's motives, Ted asked Vicky to find out what was going on. However, before she could provide him with answers, Vicky left with Clint to attend a publishers' conference in New York. Alone in New York, Clint and Vicky shared candlelit dinners and long walks together. By the end of the trip, they realized what their friends had known for months. They were in love. When Vicky returned to Llanview, she resolved to break off her relationship with Ted, but she never had the chance. With the assistance of a chemist, Ted Clayton spiked Vicky's sherry with a debilitating drug that put her under his control. During Vicky's drug-induced spell, Ted successfully instilled fear and indecision about, with her sister Karen as maid of honor and Dr. Larry Wolek as best man, Jenny Vernon became Mrs. Peter Jansen. Jenny's ex-husband, Brad, threatened to disrupt the ceremony but backed off at the last second, allowing Jenny to enjoy the day, her relationship with Clint. While Clint was in Texas with Pat Ashley investigating her contention that the missing Nicole Bernard was actually his mother, Ted continued administering the mind-altering drug to Vicky. Through a number of manipulatory acts, he finally convinced her to marry him. Upon his return, Clint realized the extent of Ted's machinations. He warned Vicky that she would be making the biggest mistake of her life by becoming Mrs. Ted Clayton. For the time being, Clint's words of warning went unheeded. Karen Wolek put on the performance of a lifetime as she convinced everyone, including counterfeiter Steve Piermont, that she had returned to her wild ways. She got Piermont to give her a job as a runner for the ring. Marco, ever shrewd, was the first to guess that Karen was actually trying to finish what Vince Wolek started. Steve blackmailed Marco into joining the ring, threatening to harm Edwina if he should balk. Edwina began wondering about Marco's mysterious appointments. His secret involvement proved a destructive element to his new marriage. Before long, a sad Edwina asked Marco to move out. Ted, fearing exposure, ordered Steve to put a contract out on Karen and Marco. Steve was faced with a dilemma. Having grown fond of Karen Wolek, Steve pleaded with her to run away. If she didn't extricate herself from the counterfeiting ring, she would be facing almost certain death. Karen refused and went ahead with a counterfeit money drop, but not before confiding in Ed Hall, now a captain of the Llanview Police, of her involvement. In a shootout in a deserted railroad yard, Marco was wounded in the arm, but he and Karen were able to get away from the gunman by running onto a bridge, then jumping onto a moving train. Ed arrested Steve Piermont, pleading with him to turn state's evidence against Ted Clayton. Deeply concerned that Vicky was in grave danger, Clint took action. Arriving at Vicky's carriage house, Clint pleaded with Vicky to come away with him. When she resisted, Clint picked Vicky up over his shoulder and bodily carried her away to her cabin in the mountains. When Ted learned of their whereabouts, he showed up and poisoned Clint, just like he'd done to Vince Wolek. At Llanview Hospital, doctors saved Clint's life by administering an antidote. To Vicky and Tina's horror, Ed Hall captured Ted and arrested him. As he was being carted off to jail, Ted resolved to bring Marco Dane and Karen Wolek down with him. When Karen and Marco realized they were being framed, they went on the run. They knew that Steve Piermont was the only one who could clear their names. To track him down, they joined a carnival run by Steve's family. To complicate matters, Marco and Karen were stunned to discover that Ted Clayton had escaped from jail. A young girl named Cassie Howard arrived in Llanview and took an unusual interest in Dorian Lord and her husband, Herb Callison. Lying about her age, the teenager got a job as a receptionist at the Llanview Health Club, then began making cryptic phone calls to her grandmother in California. After a few days, the youngster received devastating news. Her grandmother was dead. Dorian was stunned when Cassie finally revealed her secret. She was her daughter. Stunned, Dorian refused to believe this amazing pronouncement. Cassie was upset by her mother's rejection. Alone with Herb, Dorian admitted that she had given birth to a daughter while she was in medical school. Herb listened as Dorian explained that on September 11th, 1966, she had given birth to her boyfriend, David Rinaldi's baby. One day, Dorian came home to discover Katrina Carr finally put her sordid past behind her when she met her perfect match, beer truck driver Marcello Salta. Their blissfully innocent romance came to an abrupt halt when, on the night before their wedding, Marcello discovered her deep secret. His bride-to-be had once been a hooker. That David had taken off with their baby, Cassie. David, a concert pianist, went to live with his mother in California, then left Cassie behind and went off to Europe. In time, Dorian and Cassie agreed to face this new relationship one step at a time. To win over her daughter, Dorian threw a special surprise party for Cassie, attended by everyone who was anyone in Llanview. Heard the fall, Tony Lord came back to Llanview, where he met and became instant friends with Bo Buchanan. Tony's former flame, Pat, was otherwise occupied. Through a series of events, Pat and Clint correctly surmised that Asa was keeping Nicole Bernard prisoner somewhere in Llanview. But not for long. Nicole escaped and plotted to get even with the husband who had ruined her life. With glee, she decided to hatch her revenge scheme at Asa's upcoming masquerade ball, honoring his new wife, Samantha Vernon Buchanan. When the evening of the ball finally arrived, Nicole wasn't the only uninvited guest hiding behind a mask. The evil Dr. Ivan Kipling, who had fled to South America the previous year, had returned to Llanview to wreak havoc once again. Nicole donned her mask and an exact copy of Samantha's dress, then proceeded to lock Sam in a walk-in freezer. Slipping into the party, Nicole confronted Bo, telling him the incredible truth that she was the mother he never knew, and she'd been kept imprisoned in a sanitarium for years by Asa. She pleaded with Bo to shoot Asa. Bo, mesmerized by this incredible revelation, headed back to the ball. He might have actually carried out Nicole's deadly request had he not been intercepted by Clint and Pat. Nicole stunned the assembled guests by pulling off her mask and revealing that she was Olympia Buchanan, very much alive. Meanwhile, Asa hurried to rescue Samantha from the locked freezer. Having heard Nicole's story, Sam was furious. She refused to accept Asa's lies for another minute. Sam coldly told Asa that she was leaving him, for he had deceived her for the last time. Asa's nightmare was far from over. Nicole wanted him dead. When she got Asa alone, the first Mrs. Buchanan pulled out a pistol and shot her ex-husband. Samantha rushed to Asa's side and grabbed for the gun. In the struggle, Nicole tripped on the balcony. As Sam reached out to save her, Nicole lost her footing and plummeted to the ground below. In the aftermath, Samantha told Asa that, having been manipulated for the last time, she must leave him. Bo visited his mother in the hospital. In excruciating pain, she spoke 3 final words to her son. Pat, your father, before dying. Confused, Bo confronted Pat, who was compelled to tell him the shocking news that Asa Buchanan was not his real father. Bo was stunned to learn that his real father was the late Yancey Ralston. Bo bitterly vowed to make Asa pay dearly for the sins he had perpetrated on his family. Framed for a 1981 crime they didn't commit, fugitives Mark O'Dane and Karen Wallach found refuge in a carnival, where they made a 4-legged friend. Bo's whole life had been a lie. He was deeply hurt by the news that Asa was not his real father. Embittered and vengeful, Bo declared war on Asa Buchanan. First on his agenda, he renounced the Buchanan name, declaring that his new name was Bo Ralston. Pat Ashley became jealous when Bo began dating Georgina Whitman, a bright and beautiful scientist who had come to town with Pat's old flame, Tony Lord. Tony and Georgina were on a top-secret project involving solaramite, a rare metal mineral that they hoped could be mined, processed, then used as a cheap alternative to oil fuel. They struck pay dirt, discovering huge stores of solaramite under the lawn fair and Moore Cliff mansions. Before long, Bo teamed up with Georgina and Tony and engaged in a bitter battle with Asa and his new partner, Dorian Lord, who had recently separated from husband Herb Callison. Georgina developed a vacuum extractor to mine solaramite, but the plans for the high-tech machinery turned out to be faulty. The device was dangerous. Bo raced to warn Asa, who had stolen the plans and built the machine, but he wouldn't listen. Asa pulled the switch that began the machine's operation, and the 2 men narrowly escaped death when the device exploded in a burst of flames. Later, Bo risked his own life when he agreed to test drive a car fueled by solaramite. The car exploded, and this time Asa pulled Bo from the flames. Still, the near tragedies failed to reconcile Bo and Asa. The 2 stubborn men remained estranged. Bo's romance with Georgina fizzled too, and she left Llanview to join a California firm that was building the first manned space vehicle to Mars. One couple who found romance was Pat Ashley and Tony Lord. After much coaxing, Pat came to accept Tony's adventurous lifestyle and married the man she loved in a beautiful wedding ceremony. When an opening in the Banner's Middle East Bureau came about, Pat refused to stand in her husband's way. Bo's quest to discover his Ralston roots took him to Louisiana, where he met his Aunt Euphemia. The eccentric old woman harbored a secret grudge against the long-lost relative who popped up on her doorstep. Euphemia was less than cordial to Bo, but her nephew, Drew, a med student, seemed quite eager to come to Llanview. What Bo didn't realize was that Drew had strict instructions from the Ralston clan to bring down the Buchanan Empire and restore the Ralston fortune. But once in Llanview, Drew seemed an unwilling participant, and he developed a fascination for Samantha. Soon a second Ralston, Delilah, showed up in town. The beautiful young woman who worked in a rodeo was not a participant in her mother Euphemia's plan to sabotage the Buchanans. In fact, Delilah had been estranged from her family for years. Before long, she found herself a Buchanan of her own, Asa. The old coot was instantly enchanted by Delilah's beauty, sex appeal, and her endless ability to surprise him. Beau grew resentful and jealous as Asa continued his efforts to hook Delilah. To take his mind off his gorgeous cousin, Beau turned his attention to single singer Becky Lee Abbott. When Ted Clayton escaped from jail, Tina wasn't surprised. By now, she knew that this man who claimed to be her father was as slippery as they came. However, Tina was in for the shock of her life when she encountered a smartly dressed woman in an art gallery. Suddenly, the woman whipped off her wig. It was Ted in disguise. Before he could harm Tina, Captain Ed Hall shot and killed him. Tina, traumatized by the horrible events, left town to start a new life. After Ted's death, Marco and Karen finally were able to clear their names in the counterfeiting scheme. Steve Piermont was sentenced to a short jail term for his role in the illegal operation. As for Vicky, Ted was gone, but the path was still far from clear for romance with Clint Buchanan. Vicky wanted some time to herself, and that drove a love-struck Clint Buchanan crazy. At the Banner, Clint found it exceedingly difficult to work beside the woman he loved without any positive feedback from her. What to do? Resign. That's what. With great sadness, Vicky accepted Clint's decision to take a new job as executive editor at the Banner's chief competitor, The Chronicle. The battle lines were drawn. Landview's press war took on new fury when Clint lured prize-winning reporter Edwina Lewis away from the Banner. Working side by side, Clint and Edwina began a torrid affair. For the first time in years, Dr. Larry Wolek was content and happy. Divorced from Karen, Larry eagerly anticipated marrying his new love, Mimi King. Just before the wedding, Larry met up with the renowned Dr. Hugo Wilde, who was actually his mortal enemy, Ivan Kipling. Kipling coldly informed Larry that he was about to atone for his sins. Larry screamed in horror as he realized that Ivan was about to perform surgery on him. Larry awoke with no memory of what had taken place in the operating room. He was unaware that Ivan was now controlling his every move through a device implanted in his brain. Returning to Longview, Larry never showed up for his own wedding. Mimi, who was left standing at the altar, was devastated. Instead of marrying Mimi, Larry had gone straight to Karen, telling her that he still loved her dearly. Before long, Ivan's ultimate aim became apparent. He wanted to capture Karen Wolek and was using Larry to do his bidding. Ivan and his assistant, Astrid Collins, came to Landview to keep tabs on Larry and Karen. Moving into Timberdark Farm on the outskirts of town, they befriended Dorian's young daughter, Cassie. When Captain Ed Hall grew suspicious of the strange activities at the farm, he showed up at Timberdark, only to have Dr. Kipling implant a device in his brain too. Finally, Ivan apprehended his real prey, Karen Wolek. Luring her to Timberdark, he issued an ultimatum to her. If she agreed to come away with him to his South American jungle paradise, then he would leave instructions for the removal of the implants from Ed's and Larry's brains. If not, the devices would soon dissolve, killing both of them. Karen had no choice but to agree. Reluctantly, she boarded a plan with Dr. Kipling, as Marco arrived in the nick of time to rescue Larry and Ed. After piecing together the clues, Marco, Jenny, and Larry, recovered from the operation to remove his implant, arrived in Ivan's paradise, located deep in the jungles of San Carlos. When bandits attacked Marco, Larry alone continued the search for Karen, who had no choice but to marry Ivan in a bizarre wedding ceremony at his lavish plantation. Just before he tried to consummate their marriage, Karen escaped into the jungle. Ivan and his guards gave chase, but Larry heroically rescued Karen in the nick of time. Grateful to see him, Karen raced into Larry's open arms and they shared a passionate reunion. But the nightmare was far from over. Together, Karen and Larry faced numerous perils in the jungle, but their strong and renewed love prevailed. Ivan's turncoat assistant, Astrid, made her own escape and joined them in a hazardous flight downriver. In a climactic chase, Ivan caught up with the escaping trio. In a life-and-death fight on the riverbank, Larry prevailed, sending the demented Dr. Kipling to the crocodiles. Back in Landview, Marco Dane turned his attentions to a new career, showbiz. Marco directed a murder mystery movie, Blood Moon, which he shot on location in Landview. Marco was especially enthused about the script based on the Hatchfield murders, an actual event that had occurred in Landview 15 years earlier. Joining Marco in the new enterprise was his long-estranged younger brother, Gary Corelli, who was making a play for Cassie Callison's affections. However, Cassie was playing the field, dating both Gary Corelli and wealthy Kyle Dickinson. Soon, life imitated art on the set of Blood Moon when the lead actor, Rudy Lavasso, was murdered. It was obvious to all that the killer wanted Blood Moon shut down. Marco and Captier's Ed Hall set a trap to catch the killer. However, their plan went awry when Marco's ex-wife, Edwina, saw a gunman about to shoot him. Edwina threw herself in front of Marco and took a near-fatal bullet. The killer turned out to be Kyle Dickinson, the son of the culprit in the actual Hatchfield murder case. Kyle held Cassie hostage, then Dorian, before being apprehended and locked away. After nearly 3 years, Marco and Karen's notorious baby switch came one step closer to being revealed when Dorian received a letter from her institutionalized sister, Melinda, stating that Mary Vernon was really Katrina's baby, not Jenny's. Dorian, unaware of the implications, showed the letter to Marcello Salta. Fille mamitapid, series of events, Marcello told Larry, who confronted Karen and forced her to reveal her part in the baby switch. To protect Jenny, Larry vowed to keep the switch secret. But Marcello didn't. When Marcello told the news to a stunned Katrina, she demanded proof. Larry tried to convince Kat that what Marcello had told her was a ridiculous rumor. She then confronted Marco, who feigned surprise at the incredible tale. Karen, however, could no longer hide the truth from her dear friend. With her back against the wall, Karen confessed. Katrina wanted to tell Jenny at once, and Marcello tried in vain to make her wait. He insisted that if anyone should tell Jenny, it should be the man she loved, her husband, Peter Jansen. Peter agonized over the moment that was finally at hand. He raced home from the hospital to face Jenny before she learned the terrible truth from Katrina. But Peter never made it. Just as Katrina was about to reveal the baby switch to Jenny, the Landview police arrived with grim news. Peter had been killed in a car accident. In view of Jenny's horrible loss, Katrina said nothing further about the baby switch. Peter's death had momentarily stopped Katrina from revealing the truth to Jenny. In the weeks after, Brad convinced Kat to stay silent by proposing marriage to her. He promised that if she married him, then Katrina would be little Mary's stepmother and would see her often. Kat accepted Brad's proposal, and the secret was finally safe once again. Or was it? Jenny's lingering suspicions drove her to steal the key to Brad's safe deposit box, and there she found the audio tape that Brad had secretly made of Peter confessing the switch to a priest. The bombshell disclosure stunned Jenny, but it did not destroy her. The shocking knowledge of the baby switch turned Jenny into a woman who would take desperate measures to keep her child. With renewed inner strength, she returned Brad's tape and kept the discovery to herself. Jenny's hopes shattered when she encountered Katrina in the cemetery while paying a sorrowful visit to her real baby. Seeing Jenny in tears, Katrina realized that she finally knew the truth. Katrina was faced with a dilemma. Should she fight for her baby in the courts or marry Brad and be Mary's stepmother? Ever the cad, Brad answered the question for Katrina when she caught him proposing to Jenny. Sadly, Jenny realized she must give her daughter to Katrina to prevent the pain Mary would suffer in a courtroom custody battle, and to keep Marco and Karen from going to prison. In a tearful, poignant moment, Jenny handed over the girl she loved with all her heart to Katrina. Meanwhile, the implications of the baby switch reverberated throughout Landview. Most of all, Dorian Lord demanded in a televised editorial that the perpetrator of the crime be brought to justice. When the district attorney's office began harassing Jenny, Vicky, who now knew the truth, countered with her own angry editorial in which she stated that she knew for a fact Jenny was innocent. She would only say that this information came from a privileged source of information. Before a grand jury, Vicky refused to name her source and was sent to jail. Of all people, Vicky's rival, Clint Buchanan, worked endless hours to obtain her release. In the process, he and Vicky grew close again, and with bars between them, Clint proposed. When Vicky's prison vigil came to an end, she and Clint became man and wife. They married in a beautiful autumn ceremony held at Vicky's family home, Lanfair, which the newlyweds moved into after having Dorian evicted. Karen and Larry decided to hold off on their own wedding plans until the baby switch crisis cooled. Their stormy reunion was threatened by the return of Steve Piermont, who had recently been released from jail. Steve began his romantic pursuit of Karen by sending her flowers. Then, while Larry was on the night shift, he sneaked into her bedroom and watched her sleep. Karen protested violently that he had to stop harassing her. But Marco, who knew Karen best, keenly observed that Karen's failure to tell Larry about Steve indicated hidden passions that she refused to admit, even to herself. Marco's insights were right on target. While Larry was away at a medical conference, Steve visited Karen, and they kissed passionately. In vain, Karen tried to resist, but she finally succumbed to his dynamic presence. Throughout the fall of 1982, Karen tried to banish the fantasies she was having about Steve from her mind. For solace, she fled to a country inn in Nantucket, but when Steve followed, Karen couldn't resist his allure. During a stormy night, they made love in a shack on the beach. Back in Landview, Karen discovered that a contract had been put out on Steve by the mob. Trying to help him, she became a target too. Steve pleaded with Karen, telling her that they would die unless they left town immediately. Karen was perplexed. While stalling for time, Steve was shot and seriously injured. Together, they fled town. Larry tracked Steve and Karen back to Nantucket, where Karen was forced to make the painful choice between the two men who loved her. With great difficulty, she chose Steve, because his need for her was greater. While a dejected Larry journeyed back to Landview, Steve and Karen headed for Canada to start a fugitive life. Herb Callison adopted Dorian's daughter Cassie and remained her dearest friend and closest confidant throughout his stormy marriage to her mother. When Herb walked out on Dorian in 1983, he took Cassie with him. For months, Asa Buchanan worked hard to win back Beau's love. But Beau, having discovered that Asa was not really his father, wanted nothing to do with the man he used to call Pa. Now, early in the winter of 1983, Asa had stumbled upon an incredible secret. Beau really was his son, after all. The shocking revelation, which came in the form of a letter from Delilah's Aunt Twyla to Beau, provided indisputable proof that Yancey Ralston was sterile. There was no way he could have sired Beau. The news thrilled Asa, but when he went to tell Beau, Asa couldn't help but notice the developing closeness between his son and Delilah. Asa realized that revealing the secret would send Delilah directly into Beau's arms, and Asa wanted Delilah for himself. He clearly understood that Delilah and Beau were in love, but believing they were kin, they had been fighting the mutual attraction. To keep Delilah under his thumb and in his bed, Asa kept his mouth shut. More cunning than ever, Asa eloped with Delilah. A forlorn Beau turned his attentions to Becky Lee Abbott, who was painfully aware that he was seeing her on the rebound. In February, Asa and Brad were taking his new sailing vessel for a trial run in Florida. As they ventured out on the high seas, disaster struck. A gasoline leak in the boat's engine caused the craft to explode, and Asa and Brad were thrown into the raging waters. Violent waves separated them, and Brad was certain that Asa was lost forever. The news of Asa Buchanan's drowning sent shockwaves through Landview. In his will, Asa divided the bulk of his fortune between Bo and his new wife, Delilah. In the will, Bo was perplexed by Asa's reference to my dear son. Brad provided the stunning answer to Bo's question when he revealed the secret. Bo, shocked to learn he was a Buchanan after all, was deeply enraged that Asa had kept the truth to himself, knowing that Delilah might not marry him if she knew that Bo was not her cousin. Of course, Asa wasn't dead at all. Certain there was a conspiracy to assassinate him and that Bo and Delilah were having a love affair, Asa had instructed Brad to sneak him back to Landview. While Asa and Brad implemented their plan, Bo and Delilah's brewing passions finally overtook them. They made love, promising themselves they would marry after a respectable period of time. Little did they realize that Asa's return was imminent. At the memorial service honoring Asa, who should show up but the dead man himself? To Bo and company, Asa's resurrection was as shocking as his death. Seeking to reclaim what was his, Asa set out to keep Delilah away from Bo. Confused and incapable of coping with all that had happened, Delilah was faced with a dilemma. Which Buchanan would she choose? In spite of her love for Bo, Delilah felt honor-bound to remain with her husband. But Clint and Bo worked together to change Delilah's mind. They knew that they could win over Delilah by branding Asa as a liar. After Delilah heard the truth, that Asa knew all along, that he was Bo's father, but had lied so that he could win her for himself, she left the old man, stricken, angry, and stubborn. Asa vowed revenge on all those who had betrayed him. Bo rejoiced in the discovery that he was finally free to be with Delilah. However, there were complications. Bo had recently made love to Becky Lee, and now she was pregnant. Becky Lee confided the news to Drew Ralston, then Larry Wolek, but chose not to tell Bo because she knew he was in love with Delilah. For now, Becky Lee would be content with single motherhood. A chance encounter at the gynecologist's office led Delilah to discover Becky Lee's delicate condition. Alarmed that she would tell Bo she was carrying his baby, Delilah pressed for a fast divorce from Asa and a hasty marriage to Bo. In May, Delilah Ralston became Mrs. Bo Buchanan in a ceremony held at Landfair. Bede Vernon continued to romance his ex-wife Jenny, who was otherwise occupied consoling Larry Wolek after Karen's painful departure. Jenny became so convinced that Brad had changed his evil ways that she consented to marry him again. Brad, realizing that he had accomplished a minor miracle in winning Jenny away from Larry, strove to keep the slate clean so that she would never be disappointed in him again. Dancing around Asa's machinations, however, made the assignment quite difficult for him, so he quit to open a new hotel, the Vernon Inn. Suspicious of Becky Lee, Asa forced her to admit that she was pregnant with Bo's baby. Becky knew that Asa would try to use this knowledge to destroy Bo and Delilah's marriage. Before she would allow that to happen, Becky Lee threatened Asa, informing him that if he revealed her pregnancy to Bo, he would never lay eyes on his grandchild. For the moment, Asa's hands remained tied. The thought of another Buchanan offspring filled him with joy. Asa offered to support Becky Lee and her baby if she would let him raise the child. But she refused because she had accepted a proposal of marriage from a benevolent soul, Drew Ralston, whose own romance with Samantha Vernon Buchanan had fizzled. However, on their wedding day, Drew was shot and killed in a botched robbery at the florist shop where he was buying Becky Lee's bouquet. Becky Lee vowed to name her baby Drew after the valiant young man who had given his life for her. After Asa promised that he would not expect her to sleep with him, she agreed to become his wife. Asa firmly believed that she would, in time, come to love him. Becky Lee wrote a letter to Bo, explaining that her baby was his. Leaving the letter in Vicky's car, with instructions that it was only to be read upon the event of her death, Becky Lee married Asa. As for Delilah, she returned from her honeymoon only to learn she was sterile, Certain that Beau would leave her when he learned that she could not give him what he wanted most in the world, Delilah concocted an incredible lie, telling Beau she was carrying his baby. Caught up in a web of lies, Delilah finally admitted her deceit to Beau, whose heart went out to his barren wife. Unforeseen kidney problems made the final stages of Becky Lee's pregnancy treacherous. After the birth of her son, Drew, her condition worsened. Fearing she would die, an anguished Asa told Beau the truth. He was the father of Becky Lee's baby. Beau was overjoyed to have what he had wanted most in the world, a son. Feeling neglected, Delilah began an affair with the disreputable Anthony McConna. In rapid time, Beau filed for divorce from Delilah, though she managed to convince him to postpone his plans to end their marriage. To make himself forget his wayward wife, Beau turned his attentions to his newly acquired football team, the Landview Cougars. Little did he know that the notorious Anthony McConna had paid the Cougars' star player, Alec Loans, $30,000 to throw a big game. Alec, who was dating the much older Carla Hall, who had returned to Landview after obtaining her law degree, changed his mind and actually became the hero of the game. After suffering an injury, Alec was saddened by the discovery that he could never play football again. A jealous Ed Hall watched from afar as his ex-wife Carla comforted the ailing athlete. Though still in love with Carla, Ed poured his energies into a relationship with Courtney Wright, the Cougars' press agent. Unable to accept the demise of her marriage to Beau, Delilah decided to lose herself in dance, exotic dance. She accepted a job at Wildlife, a new wave disco run secretly by Anthony McConna and his partner Laurel Chapin. As the spotlight entertainer, doing erotic and sensational dances for the appreciative clientele, Delilah abandoned all concern for her reputation as Mrs. Beau Buchanan. As she danced, Delilah was unaware that a secret admirer had come to watch her perform. It was Brad Vernon. Brad had stumbled on the club quite by accident after a serious fight with Jenny. Their relationship came to an abrupt end when Brad learned that Katrina was taking a job in Florida and intended to take Mary with her. Anonymously, he mailed a news clipping about Kat's hooker past to her prospective employer. Kat lost the job, and when Jenny discovered Brad's ruthless act, she ended their engagement, and this time, their breakup was forever. Another long-standing romance came to an abrupt end when Pat Ashley received the sorrowful news that her husband Tony had been killed while on a dangerous assignment in war-torn Lebanon. Vicky and Clint offered what consolation they could, but Landview only brought Pat painful memories. Working for her archenemy Dorian Lord at WVLE didn't help much either. With a fond farewell to her loving friends, Pat left town to accept an exciting new job at a Chicago TV station. Marco Dane was busy with two new jobs, running a legitimate health club by day and a fly-by-night modeling agency, Dream Faces by night. For a while, he led a double personal life too, juggling romances with both Samantha and Edwina. Marco struggled valiantly to prevent the two women from discovering his deception. The Countess Echo de Savoy, a world-renowned photographer, arrived in Landview along with her brother Giles Morgan. Echo moved into the garage apartment at Land Fair and set out to implement a mysterious plot against the very married Clint Buchanan. Clint found her hauntingly familiar, but could not understand why she stirred such feelings in him. Clint became so drawn to Echo that one day he kissed her. Days later, they made love. In the afterglow, Clint's memory flashed to Giselle, a woman he had known years earlier. Clint struggled to remember more. Who was she? He knew that Giselle looked exactly like Echo, but that's all he could recall. Echo knew all too well why she resembled this mystery woman from Clint's past. Giselle was her dead mother. Firmly believing that Clint was responsible for Giselle's fall from a bridge to her death, Echo wanted revenge. She planned to fake her own death and frame Clint for the crime. Echo carefully followed the plan that Giles masterminded for her, with one exception. She never expected to fall in love with Clint. Still, at Giles's urging, She followed through with the scheme by luring Clint to an old Landview bridge, engaging him in a bitter brawl, then jumping to her death. Dorian Lord, who witnessed the encounter from afar, declared in court that Clint had pushed Echo. Vicky and Marco tracked down the very much alive Echo, who confessed her deception under oath during Clint's pretrial hearing. When Clint was set free, Echo and Giles moved out of Landview, leaving Vicky and Clint to reconstruct their damaged marriage. Handsome and suave David Rinaldi had charmed Vicky in order to get the job as conductor of the prestigious Landview Philharmonic. David, however, went out of his way to avoid meeting Dorian. After his job was secure and his contract signed, David consented to see her. The rage Dorian displayed when she was finally face to face with him confused everyone. Only David knew the reason for this apparent hatred. He was the man who had walked out on her years earlier, taking their baby daughter Cassie with him. David made an uneasy peace with Dorian, then struck up an easy friendship with Jenny Jansen. Soon Cassie returned from school in Europe, and to Dorian's dismay, she was charmed by her newfound father, and vice versa. This, of course, only served to enrage Dorian further. In an effort to protect her daughter, Dorian had a legal document drawn up for David to sign. It stated that in the event of Dorian's and Herb's demise, David would not attempt to obtain Cassie's inheritance for himself. This move infuriated David, who declared that he would never turn his back on his daughter again. Danger followed David Rinaldi to Landview when it was revealed that this talented concert pianist had once been a spy. Years earlier, David had been involved in an underground railroad of sorts, smuggling terrorist rebels out of foreign countries. When David's old organization recruited him again, he refused adamantly. But before long, David Rinaldi found himself lured back into a life of illegal espionage. He was risking his life and that of his loved ones by playing secret agent again. David's actions aroused Dorian's suspicions. Soon, Dorian was recruited by the government to aid in their plan to trap and stop David. However, it turned out that the government agents who enlisted Dorian were frauds. Eventually, David and Dorian grew close again as they teamed up to assist the FBI in capturing the dirty dealing bad guys. David was cleared of all charges, but Dorian found herself in hot water, at home. Furious at Dorian for her lies, Herb, who had only recently reconciled with his wife, walked out again, this time taking Cassie with him. Although this saddened her, Dorian realized that she would prefer to share her life with David. However, her plans were stopped in midstream upon discovering that David had begun a romance with Jenny. Once again, Dorian was alone. Getting married proved more difficult than David and Jenny ever imagined. When they first tried to tie the knot in February 1984, the unexpected arrival of David's other wife, Liat, threw the wedding into chaos. Landview eagerly anticipated the 1984 marriage of Jenny Jansen and David Rinaldi, and no one awaited the wedding with more zest than Brad and Dorian, because they were plotting to stop it. Brad had discovered through one of David's contacts in the underground that the groom-to-be had once married a woman and brought her to the United States, thus helping her escape oppression in a Southeast Asian country. Although David's marriage to Liat Reynolds was annulled shortly after her escape to the United States, a clerical error prevented it from being official. Dorian and Brad brought Liat to Landview, and on the day of Jenny and David's wedding, she appeared at the church to make a startling announcement. She was Mrs. David Rinaldi, and the wedding must not take place. After stopping the wedding, Liat left town as quickly as she had arrived. Another complication threatened David's happiness with Jenny. Laurel Chapin, terrified by the growing investigation into her partner Anthony McConaughey's shady activities, paid a visit to Dorian. The two women struggled at the top of the staircase in Dorian's duplex. Then suddenly Dorian tripped and tumbled down the stairs. David was the first to discover Dorian's unconscious body. For days, she lay in a coma, Upon regaining consciousness, Dorian, suffering from temporary paralysis, discovered that Jenny might be willing to give David another chance, so she stepped up her own scheme against the lovers. Dorian proceeded to tell Jenny a vicious lie, claiming that David was the one who'd pushed her down the stairs. Only if Jenny refused to marry David would Dorian keep this information from the police. Jenny had no choice. To save David, she had to break up with him. Unable to cope with the sorrow of her breakup, Jenny left town for a religious retreat. Convinced that she could trust no one, she decided to renew her vows as a nun. Dorian's subtle scheme to seduce David was hampered by Herb, who realized that he was still in love with her. Herb stopped their divorce proceedings, ended his budding romance with Edwina Lewis, and moved into Dorian's duplex to help during her convalescence. When Dorian regained the use of her legs, she kept the big event to herself. Nothing and no one could stop her mission to seduce David. No one but Laurel Chapin, who, after being hit by a car and healed by her new love, Larry Wolick, confessed the truth that Dorian fell down the stairs. David did not push her. With no obstacles in their path, Jenny was finally free to marry her man. On June 1st, 1984, Jenny and David became man and wife. The newlyweds looked forward to a long and happy life together. Bo Buchanan, his marriage to Delilah in a shambles, sought to make sweeping changes in his life. He found just what he needed in Landview's O'Neill family. The O'Neills, patriarch Harry and his 3 daughters, Dee Dee, Connie, and Joy, were proud working-class people whose livelihood depended on their work at the Lord Manning plant, which owners Vicky and Clint were considering closing because of severe financial problems. The plant workers, led by feisty Connie O'Neill, hated the Lords and Buchanans. To avoid conflict because of his name, Bo introduced himself to the O'Neills as Bill Brady, an unemployed laborer, just another working stiff. In rapid time, Bill moved into the O'Neill home and found irresistible comfort in this unknown working-class world. Continuing his masquerade, Bo rolled up his sleeves and took a job at the plant, assisting Harry O'Neill in a proposal to save the place by having the workers take over the failing enterprise. Away from the plant, Bo immersed himself in the fabric of the close-knit O'Neill family and fell in love with eldest daughter Dee Dee. Dee Dee, however, was engaged to marry the plant's legal counselor, Mark Pemberton, who was secretly draining Lord Manning funds and committing heinous acts of sabotage at the plant. Toiling day after day in the Lord Manning plant, Bo clandestinely investigated several acts of apparent sabotage that took place. Mark ran, scared. Feeling the noose tightening around his neck, he pressured Dee Dee to elope with him. Just then, Dee Dee found out that Bill was a phony. The stunning discovery that her friend Bill Brady was really a Buchanan propelled her to run away with her fiancé. In the nick of time, Bo discovered Mark's crimes, but the lawyer escaped, then took Vicky hostage in hopes of leaving the country with her. Posing as Clint, Mark took Vicky to the airport. But the real Clint arrived in time to struggle with Mark and prevent him from detonating a plastic explosive that he had brought with him. Dee Dee, safe and secure, planted a big kiss on Bo's lips. Bo and Dee Dee were in love. The crisis over, Bill Brady returned to his old identity and faced new challenges. Harry, hurt by Bo's masquerade, ordered him to move out of the O'Neill house. Thinking that Bo still loved Delilah, Dee Dee began to believe that she and Bo were not meant for each other after all. Desperate to prove his feeling for Dee Dee, Bo took 2 important steps. First, he told Delilah that their divorce plans were still on. Second, he abducted Dee Dee against her will and whisked her away to New York. In the Big Apple, Bo introduced Dee Dee to a fantasy world that only the very rich could buy. For a moment, it seemed that she could happily live the dream forever. When Bo and Dee Dee got engaged, Asa teamed up with Delilah to try to break them up. They brought Dee Dee's first lover, Brian Beckett, from Tucson to Landview. Brian was determined to win Dee Dee back from Bo and began his stay in town by giving Bo a black eye. Dee Dee's sister Connie took a job at the Vernon Inn, and before long she was engaged to the hotel's owner, Brad, blissfully unaware that he was facing financial collapse. After failing in scheme after scheme designed to destroy Bo and Dee Dee's relationship, Asa finally gave up. Brooding, he refused to attend their wedding. Instead, he packed up Becky Lee and baby Drew and flew to Arizona. Unfortunately, their private plane ran into foul weather, and the Buchanans were forced to parachute to the ground before the pilot made a crash landing. Asa and Drew survived the night in an abandoned building. But where was Becky Lee? Asa searched high and low for his wife, but she was gone. Back in Longview, the disaster forced Bo and Dee Dee to postpone their wedding. Was Becky Lee Buchanan really dead? Not at all. Suffering from amnesia, she was working as a waitress in a New Mexico tavern. Calling herself Maria Hathaway, Becky Lee developed a close relationship with the short-order cook, Jesse Wild. Meanwhile, Asa offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. A greedy couple, Lou and Evelyn Maddox, discovered her whereabouts, but they demanded a cool $1 million for her safe return. Now Longview's assistant district attorney, Carla Scott, rekindled her old love for ex-husband Ed Hall. However, their budding romance suffered irreparable damage when Carla was forced to indict Ed in the murder of mobster Hervé Boudin. In lighter vein, Marco Dane discovered that his wacky, red-headed secretary, Maxie McDermott, had been lying to her mother for several years. Complete with phony press clippings, Maxie had convinced her mother that she was a successful, famous singer who lived in a mansion and was engaged to marry none other than Marco himself. The silly scheme backfired when Maxie's mother called to say she was moying to Ireland to live out her remaining years, but first wanted to stop in Longview to see her daughter, the star. With Marco's help, Maxie pulled off the scam, convincing her mother that she was a singing sensation. Samantha Vernon ended her short-term relationship with mobster Anthony McConnell when she realized that she really loved Asa's nephew, police officer Rafe Garrettson. Rafe and Samantha were married at the Crown Casino Hotel in Atlantic City, but the ceremony was interrupted when mobster Hervé Boudin suddenly raced through the reception room. He had just murdered Leo Coronal, kingpin of an important Philadelphia crime family. Leo's grandson, Rob Coronal, witnessed the shooting, fled the scene, and escaped to Longview, where he took refuge in the deserted Athenaeum Theater. There he met and fell hopelessly in love with Cassie Callison. Cassie, fed up with her mother's manipulations, had recently left home. When Dorian threw her a grand party for her 18th birthday, Cassie angrily burned her mother's gift, a check for $1 million, and made a public declaration of her independence. She was equally enchanted with Rob. Rob Coronal was the son of mobster Alessandro Coronal, who had changed his name to Alex Crown and gone straight, buying a string of legitimate hotels. After the death of his father, Leo, Alex was approached by mob leader Descamides. The organization wanted him to replace Leo Coronal as head of the Coronal crime family. Alex was reluctant, preferring a normal life for his son, Rob. Alex had raised Rob alone after his wife, Laurel Chapin, had died in childbirth. Now, years later, Alex discovered to his amazement that she was alive. Laurel was equally amazed to learn that her son, who was stolen from her at childbirth by Leo Coronal, was hiding out somewhere in Longview. Together, Alex and Laurel tracked down Rob, who had disappeared after the shooting in Atlantic City. They shared a touching but tentative reunion. Samantha Vernon had also caught a glimpse of the killer, Hervé Boudin. Newly married and blissfully happy, Sam tried to dispel her doubts and fears that Boudin would kill her too. Sadly, Sam's fears came true when Boudin shot her at the Vernon Inn Health Club. Brad and Rafe, who were at the club, responded quickly and discovered Sam floating face down in the hot tub. At the hospital, Dr. Larry Wolek pronounced Sam brain dead, and told Rafe some amazing news. Sam was pregnant when she drowned. To the surprise of many, Delilah offered to bear Sam's unborn baby. Rafe agreed, and doctors swiftly performed an embryo transplant from Sam's womb to Delilah's. When the procedure was completed, Dr. Will Vernon sadly turned off the machines that were keeping his daughter alive. Rafe, destroyed at the loss of his new bride, took a leave of absence from the police force to search full-time for Sam's killer. Catla Scott, now Landview's assistant district attorney, was having a difficult time in the romance department. Her boyfriend, retired football hero Alec Lowndes, suffered from a lack of self-worth after a knee injury ended his career. Alec was forced to accept a job from the slimy Anthony McConaughey and reluctantly became official greeter at McConaughey's nightclub, Wildlife. At police headquarters, Carla began spending lots of time reminiscing with her ex-husband, Captain Ed Hall, about the wonderful times they shared during their marriage. Ed cared deeply for his ex-wife, but was busy romancing Courtney Wright. Realizing that she didn't love Alec, Carla made a decision. She left the football star and moved in with her mother, Sadie Gray. Sadie took every opportunity to drop discreet hints about how Ed and her daughter should renew their relationship. Before long, it was like old times for Ed and Carla. They terminated their respective relationships with Courtney and Alec and rekindled the old sparks again. However, Ed and Carla's renewed love suffered greatly when Ed was forced to kill mobster Hervé Boudin in self-defense. Boudin's daughter, Michelle, who came to live with David and Jenny, claimed she saw Ed shoot her father in cold blood. When no gun was found on the dead man, Ed was suspended from the police force pending a grand jury investigation into the case. Carla, the newly elected district attorney, fostered the dismal task of presenting the case against him in court. With Rafe Goretzon's help, it was this Samantha Vernon took delight in the amorous advances of the slick Anthony McConaughey, but when she began to suspect that he was tied to the mob, she broke off their relationship and married incorruptible cop Rafe Garrettson. Covered that Michelle had hid her father's gun after he was shot and lied about Ed firing his pistol at an unarmed man. Ed breathed a hefty sigh of relief when the charges against him were dropped. The following year, Ed was dealt another blow when Carla left Landview for greener pastures, a judgeship in Arizona. At year's end, blue-blooded Dorian Lord began an unlikely romance with blue-collared Harry O'Neill, who quickly had trouble dealing with his flamboyant paramour. Dorian, ashamed of her snobbish behavior, apologized to Harry. He accepted her willingness to change, however, and their budding romance intensified. Vicky received a shock when, out of the blue, Tina returned to town with startling news. While reading her late mother's diary, she had discovered that Ted Clayton was not her father after all. Armed with this incredible discovery, Tina was moving back to Landview to find her real daddy. Let the games begin. While searching for his missing wife, Becky, Asa received much-needed moral support from his old friend, Lucinda Schenck. 1985 began on a strange note for Becky Lee Buchanan, who was now living in New Mexico and suffering from amnesia. Struggling to discover her real identity, Becky Lee agreed to go with her friend Jesse Wild to his home in Avery, Tennessee, where she joined him and his sister Clover in the operation of their family tavern. Clover grew to resent Becky, who was straying further from her desire to find out her true identity because she was falling in love with Jesse. Working side by side, Becky Lee and Jesse became lovers. Back home in Landview, Asa grieved over his missing wife and took out his frustrations on the world. He immediately dropped his oil prices in an attempt to destroy his competition. His greatest threat seemed to come from fellow oil baron Lydia Farr, an American living in Venice, who was determined that Asa would not ruin her. Before long, both Asa and his adversary Lydia found themselves prisoners together in Venice, having been kidnapped by Lydia's devious partner, Peter Russo. Imprisoned together, Asa and Lydia became squabbling combatants. Hearing of his father's kidnapping, Beau flew to Venice to rescue him, but was astonished to find sexy government agent Jinx Rollins working on the case too. When Dee Dee found out that Beau was with Jinx, she was jealous and angry. not believing Beau's claim that their friendship was innocent. Jinx's jealous boyfriend, Marco, followed them to Venice and joined in the search for Asa. Also, a beautiful Italian waif, Giulietta Fellini, grew instantly fascinated by Beau and offered her own knowledge of the city as an aid to the rescuers. Marco and Beau rescued Asa, who was stunned to discover that Becky Lee had returned to Landview. Jessie Wilde, who had stumbled upon Becky Lee's true identity, loved her too much to keep it a secret forever. Along with Jessie, Becky returned to Landview, and her memory remained clouded until she saw her baby boy, Drew. As she cuddled Drew, Becky Lee's memory came flooding back. Now, which man would she choose, Asa or Jessie? Faced with this troubling dilemma, Becky Lee realized that she cared deeply for Asa, but she truly loved Jessie. Sadly, Asa turned Drew over to Becky Lee, who started her happy new life in Tennessee. Beau returned from Venice to find Dee Dee unsure if she wanted to marry him. Certain that Beau was having an affair with Jinx, Dee Dee ended their relationship. Rafe Garretson became a new daddy in 1985. Delilah, who had become Rafe's and his late wife Samantha's surrogate mother, gave birth to a baby daughter. Delilah handed the precious child over to Rafe, who named her Sammy in honor of his late wife. Beau's fun-loving buddy from his days in Vietnam, Michael James Woody Woodward, came to Landview. Woody arrived in a helicopter and announced he was in Landview to make a movie, Backfire, starring Beau's and Asa's old flame, Mimi King. Beau quickly found himself caught in the middle as he watched Woody make time with his old pal Mimi, who was fast becoming something more than a pal to him. Woody turned out to be an agent working for the National Security Bureau, investigating the Buchanans. More than anything, Beau missed his beloved Dee Dee, and she still loved him. When Rafe proposed marriage to her, Dee Dee gently turned him down. One day, Dee Dee wrote Beau a letter, declaring her love, but couldn't bring herself to mail it. Soon, tragedy struck when Dee Dee, while checking out the new Section B at the Lord Manning plant, stumbled upon illegal activity. It seemed that workers, led by her rival Jack Simmons, were manufacturing microchips to be used in high-tech weapons being sold to foreign governments on the black market. During her investigation, Dee Dee was blinded by an explosion in the Lord Manning microchip room. Beau rushed to her side and, seeing her in pain, poured out his feelings. Dee Dee, convinced that he proclaimed his love for her only because she was blind, still couldn't agree to become his wife. He wouldn't relent. With the assistance of a barbershop quartet, Beau asked Dee Dee to marry him. This time, she accepted. Alex Crown could not accept living a life of crime. The mob wanted Alex to replace his father, Leo Coronel, as head of the Coronel crime family. Alex had other plans and refused. With the assistance of his son, Rob and Marco Dane, Alex was going to see to it that all the mob leaders were sent to jail. Marco infiltrated the mob, tricking the boss, Descamades, into thinking he was a loyal mob lieutenant. Descamades gave Marco a chilling test of loyalty, ordering him to kill Alex Crown. To accomplish the task, Marco lured Alex to a wooded area where he assassinated him. However, as planned, Alex wore a bulletproof vest. When Alex's Descamades and his fellow mobsters were rounded up and thrown in jail, letter arrived at the crime commission. Even from the grave, Alex Crown had reached out to betray the mobsters, but he wasn't done. When Descamades was released on bail, he appeared on Dorian Lord's TV interview program. Knowing that the menacing Descamades was a threat to his family, Alex took action. He lurked in the rafters of the TV studio and in front of all of Landview, shot and killed his enemy, then went underground. Larry Wolek was finally able to put his memories of Karen in the past to enjoy a new relationship with Laurel Chapin. When Larry married Laurel, the only unhappy person in attendance was Laurel's ex-husband, Alex, who returned to Landview incognito to try and stop the marriage. However, when he saw how happy Laurel was, Alex could not ruin the day for her. He retreated into the shadows. Dorian Lord was the only person to discover that Alex Crown was alive. Armed with this weapon, she confronted Rob and warned him that if he didn't immediately break his engagement to Cassie, she would tell the world that Alex was alive. Rob, realizing that this meant a certain death sentence for his father, reluctantly asked Cassie for the engagement ring back. Cassie was heartbroken, still. Refusing to believe that their love had ended, Cassie simply would not let Rob walk out of her life, and Rob, heartbroken himself, could not run away from Cassie. Before long, they got back together in private while continuing their charade in public. Eventually, Alex joined the federal government witness protection program and shared a touching goodbye with his son, Rob. Finally free of mob threats, Cassie and Rob were married. Dorian's constant interference in Cassie's life finally destroyed her marriage to Herb. The Callisons divorced in 1985, and just after, made love in the courthouse elevator. Later, Dorian received a devastating blow when her entire fortune was frozen by the IRS after Tina discovered that Victor Lord had once married Irene Clayton. Since there was no record of a divorce, Dorian's marriage to Victor was rendered invalid. Broke, Dorian was forced to go to work for an old nemesis, Asa Buchanan. Dr. Ivan Kipling lurked back into Landview along with a sidekick, a young, handsome man named Brody. They lived at Timberdark, which happened to be the summer rental home of Joy O'Neill, Cassie Callison, Rob Coronel, and Dan Wolick, Larry's teenage son, and his girlfriend Annie Barnes. Kipling, who was last seen being devoured by crocodiles after kidnapping Karen Wolick, now had a bionic metal hand. He simply wanted to be left in peace and did everything in his power to scare the kids off. Kipling's stay in Landview was short and menacing, and in rapid time, he retreated to his lair in the jungles of South America. Jenny Rinaldi was alarmed to discover that her husband David was once again secretly working as an enemy agent. Along with his old communist comrade, Ida York, David completed a secret code to transport American military secrets behind the Iron Curtain. Now, David planned to defect to East Germany with his wife, Jenny, and their teenage ward, Michelle Boudin. At the last second, David changed his mind, telling Ida that he wanted to remain in Landview with his family. Jenny watched in horror as the communist agents shot David and carried him away on a plane. For months, Jenny did not know if her beloved David was dead or alive. Just as she was getting her life back in order, David escaped from his comrades and reappeared. After explaining to Jenny that Aida had forced him to work against the U.S. government by threatening her and Cassie's lives, David came up with a plan to fake his death, then leave Landview with Jenny. However, Brad Vernon discovered the death plan and asked Jenny to marry him. This time, Brad wasn't being his usual selfish, mean-spirited self. He was doing it for Jenny, so that she could finally find happiness with David, somewhere far from Landview. After Brad married Jenny, he gave his identity and a forged passport to David. As Brad and Jenny Vernon, David and Jenny fled Landview forever. After Jenny and David safely escaped, Brad, sitting in a waterfront bar, discovered something in his pocket. It was a note wrapped around a precious opal. The valuable thank you gift was given to him by David to help him get a new start, too. Tina Clayton's search for her real father continued with her discovery of a secret room hidden behind the bookcase in the library of Lanfair. The soft lights and music led to her realization that it was Victor Lord's love den. She also discovered 11 original paintings that had disappeared from foreign museums during World War II. When Brad saw Tina leaving the secret room, she reluctantly made him an accomplice. Soon, Tina's adventures in the secret room yielded a startling discovery, a letter from Victor intended to be delivered to Vicky. In it, Victor confessed to being the father of Irene Manning's child. Tina shuddered at the realization that she was Victor Lord's daughter. Tina faced the problem of whether or not to bring this unsavory fact to Vicky's attention. She knew that Vicky would not be pleased to hear that the father, whom she deified, once seduced her 19-year-old friend. When Tina produced the letter, Vicky reacted with anger, insisting that it was a forgery, possibly created by Tina herself. Privately, Vicky began having problems dealing with this new discovery. Violent headaches and the overwhelming tension of her own foggy memory of seeing Irene in bed with her father caused Vicky's personality to split again. Nikki Smith was back. Wearing a red wig, Nikki began frequenting one of her old hangouts, the Backstreet Bar. There, she became reacquainted with an old boyfriend, Harry O'Neill. Harry was stunned to see Nicole again. He remembered how she had run away when he refused to leave his wife and kids for her. Harry found himself very much in love with Nicole, though his feelings were complicated by his new sexual relationship with Dorian Lord. At the Banner's 50th anniversary gala, Vicky praised her father publicly, and the guests were invited to enjoy a souvenir program commemorating the event. To Vicky's horror, a photocopy of Victor's confessional letter had been placed in every program. With the news now public, a horrified Vicky accused Tina, slapping her in the face before racing away in shame. Tina had other problems as well. Mitch Lawrence, an unscrupulous scoundrel who had once been her lover, came to Llanview intent on marrying Tina for her newly found fortune. Mitch seduced Tina and continually exerted a sexual hold over her. While trapped in the secret room, Mitch discovered another document in the secret room. This letter from Victor Lord stated that if Vicky should ever suffer a recurrence of her multiple personality disorder, then his entire estate and control of the Lord Foundation would go to Tina. With Tina's reluctant assistance, Mitch began an evil drive to force Nikki Smith out into the open again. Mitch devised a secret plan to kill Clint and frame Nikki Vicky for the murder. The scheme went smoothly up until the very last moment, when Tina caused Mitch's well-laid plan to backfire. Tina confronted Mitch, grabbing for the gun, and a struggle ensued. Dazed from drink, Nikki watched in horror as Harry O'Neill stumbled upon the scene. Mitch, mistaking Harry for Clint, fired at him. Harry fell to the floor and died in Nikki's arms. When she came out of her dual personality, Vicky remembered nothing of this tragic killing. She stood by in stunned silence as Tina was arrested for the murder of Harry O'Neill. Tina's insistence that Mitch was the murderer fell on deaf ears because the unscrupulous Mr. Lawrence had an airtight alibi. He claimed to be in Miami at the time of Harry's death. During the murder trial, Tina begged Vicky to testify as a witness on her behalf. Against the advice of her psychiatrist, Dr. Marcus Polk, Vicky took the stand, where she was peppered with tough questions by Tina's lawyer, Harry's brother, Pete O'Neill. When the pressure proved too much, Vicky turned into Nikki in front of a courtroom of stunned spectators. Nikki related the truth of the crime, and an APB was put out for the arrest of Mitch Lawrence. Though he escaped, Mitch was eventually arrested and sent to prison. Nikki had saved the day, but Clint was terrified when Vicky failed to reemerge. He was determined to get his wife back. Sending Kevin and Joey to live with their grandpa Asa, Clint first committed Vicky to a sanitarium, then took her to Landfair. Nikki managed to fool everyone into thinking Vicky had returned. She perfected Vicky's signature, read her diaries to learn the intimate details of her life, but was faced with one problem. How could she keep Clint out of her bed? Meanwhile, Tina had been carrying on her own campaign to get Clint into bed. Her machinations reached a peak the night a drunken Clint passed out in bed. Seizing the moment, Tina climbed in next to him. Neither of them saw Nikki when she opened the door. Shocked by the sight, Vicky emerged. She tried to call Dr. Polk, but was chloroformid by Stick, a former cellmate of Mitch's who had come to Llanview on behalf of his friend. Stick was taken by surprise when Vicky turned back into Nikki and joined in her own kidnapping. She couldn't wait to split the $1 million reward with him. It was Nikki's one chance to be free of Clint, free of Tina, and finally free to just be herself. Stick and Nikki's plot was soon discovered by a streetwise fugitive from justice, Bobby Blue. Realizing that Mrs. Buchanan was in on her own kidnapping, Bobby demanded a piece of the action. Stick had other ideas. He planned to kill Nikki and keep her share of the money. But before he could cut Nikki's throat, Clint, Bo, and Rafe arrived on the scene and shot and critically injured him. In the aftermath, Tina learned from Bobby Blue that Nikki was in cahoots with her kidnapper. Armed with the news, Tina approached Nikki and issued an ultimatum. Either she divorced Clint now, or Tina would tell all. Nikki was able to get a quick divorce, just at the time that Clint figured out that she had been pretending to be Vicky. Clint shamed her into confessing, then agreed to keep the secret that the person everyone believed was Vicky Buchanan was, in truth, Nikki Smith. Tina saw the divorce as the perfect time to try to snare Clint, and attempted to get him to marry her by claiming to be pregnant with his baby. The new year began on strikingly different notes for the two Buchanan brothers, Clint and Bo. Not only did Nikki divorce Clint, but he received the stunning news from Tina that she was pregnant with his baby and would abort the child if he didn't marry her. Reeling from the shock, Clint agreed to support the baby. But marry Tina? Never. Fortunately for Clint, Dorian discovered that Tina was faking the pregnancy, and she promptly informed Clint. For Bo, 1986 brought the answer to his prayers. Despite her blindness, Dee Dee O'Neill had agreed to become his wife. They looked forward to a romantic honeymoon after Dee Dee underwent a corneal transplant that practically guaranteed that she would regain her eyesight. Bo and Dee Dee's glorious wedding appeared to end in tragedy when Bo was shot walking up the aisle. Was Bo dead? Hardly. It was all part of an elaborate scheme, engineered by Clint, to traumatize Nikki into turning back to Vicky. The plan worked, for a moment. Nikki was aghast to see Bo shot. For a few precious seconds, Vicky's personality emerged. However, Nikki quickly returned and blasted Clint for this elaborate charade. Nikki refused to have anything to do with Clint and began spending more and more time with her unwholesome friend, Bobby Blue. Several weeks after the wedding, Bo and Dee Dee, her sight now returned, left Landview on an extended honeymoon. As Clint continued to try to bring back Vicky, Nikki Smith began to panic. She decided that the only way she could survive in Landview was to distance herself from Clint Buchanan. Wanting to be free, Nikki wrote a goodbye letter to Clint, then took off. When Clint found Nikki hiding at a country inn, he realized that it was time to take drastic measures to bring Vicky back. He concocted a plan. Clint lured Tina to the inn under the pretense that he had given up on Vicky and now wanted only her. He then arranged for Nikki to show up at his room just as he was pretending to make passionate love to Tina. Clint's hope and dream was that the sight of him and Tina might shock Vicky into re-emerging. Just as Nikki walked into the room, Clint pushed Tina onto the bed. Witnessing this horrible sight, Nikki stood frozen and transfixed. Everything went as Clint had hoped it would, and a healthy Vicky emerged. Clint hugged Vicky tightly. The woman he loved was finally back. They shared a tearful reunion. The following day, Clint and Vicky went to the Mountain View Sanitarium to have Vicky evaluated by Dr. Marcus Polk. After a careful examination, Dr. Polk gave Vicky a clean bill of health. However, another tragedy was about to send their lives into chaos. Right after Clint and Vicky left Polk's office, the doctor was stabbed in the back with a letter opener, and Clint Buchanan's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. After Clint went on trial and was convicted of the murder of Dr. Marcus Polk, Vicky worked with Rafe Garretson to find the real killer. They found evidence that the murder was committed by one of Polk's patients, a psychotic young woman named Tracy James. Not only had she killed Dr. Polk, but after developing a crush on Dr. Larry Wolek, the former psychiatric nurse turned patient murdered his wife, Laurel, too. Tracy tampered with the brakes on Laurel's car, sending her skidding to a tragic death. Once again, Larry Wolick was a bereaved widower. When Tracy escaped the mental hospital, she held Larry Wolick prisoner in the basement of her house, guarded by a ferocious Doberman named Ilse. Finally, Tracy's reign of terror came to an end when she and her pal, escaped convict Stick, were killed in an explosion. Vicky and Clint prepared to return to a normal life at Landfair, only to learn Tina had taken over the mansion, using the clause in Victor Lord's letter that if Vicky ever became Nikki Smith again, Tina would get the Lord fortune. Vicky had the Lord assets frozen and eventually won the Lord estate back. The path was finally clear for Clint and Vicky to marry again. On the morning of their wedding, Vicky delighted Clint with the incredible news that she was pregnant. Clint, thrilled to learn that he was going to be a father, proudly told his father, Asa, how happy he was to be having his first natural child. Upon hearing Clint's statement, a cloud passed over Asa's face. It was obvious that he was hiding a secret. In faraway Vienna, a dangerous escapade unfolded for David and Jenny Rinaldi, who only a year earlier had left Landview for a safe new life in Europe. While living on the lam, they were captured by their enemies. Jenny temporarily escaped from her captors and managed to send a coded message home to Vicky, Clint, Cassie, and Brad, who traveled to Austria to rescue their friends. While Clint and Vicky were in Vienna, Tina began seeing Richard Abbott, who had returned from Europe to take a job at the Banner. Just as things began to get serious between them, Tina intercepted a letter to Clint from a woman named Maria Vasquez Roberts. In the letter, Maria urged Clint to come to her home in El Paso, Texas. Intrigued, Tina went to investigate and met Maria, her husband Al, and their son Cordero. She was disappointed to learn that Maria's mysterious letter was simply a request for Clint to give Cord a job as a photographer at the Banner. Still, Tina stuck around El Paso for one reason. Cord instant chemistry sparked between Tina and Cord. Tina was charmed by the tall, handsome, straight arrow. Over the course of a week, they spent every waking moment together, enjoying the pleasures of America's Southwest. Maria frowned upon Cord and Tina's budding relationship, accusing Tina of being too trashy for her young, naive son. While photographing Tina in the stables, Cord confessed his love to her. Tina admitted that she wanted him as much as he wanted her. However, she told him that he was the wrong man for her. She was looking for a Mr. Right with money, poise, and sophistication, someone like Richard Abbott. When Richard called and asked Tina to come home, she left a note for Cord, then returned to Landview. Over Maria's objections, Cord followed Tina to Landview and got a job as a photographer at the Banner. He continued to woo Tina, telling her that he could give her everything she wanted, but Tina wanted money. Lots of money. And that was something that Cord could not provide for her, or so she believed. Unbeknownst to Tina, Cord was actually Clint's son, the product of his affair 20 years earlier with Maria. Clint and Maria had been teenage lovers, and when Maria became pregnant, she never told him. Asa, disapproving of Maria and her Mexican heritega, paid off her mother to leave town with Maria. Clint was heartbroken by Maria's disappearance and never knew that he had fathered a child, Cordero. Some 20 years later, Clint still knew nothing of his son or of his father's involvement in Maria's disappearance. Asa Buchanan was embroiled in a mess of his own in 1986. Tina discovered that Asa had for years been living another life. Posing as a sea captain named Jeb, he had married a woman named Pamela on the faraway island of Malakiva. Armed with this news, Tina decided to set Asa up. After telling an angry Pamela that Captain Jeb was really millionaire Asa Buchanan, Tina convinced Pamela to pretend to be on her deathbed, then get Asa to marry her for real. Giving in to Pamela's dying wish, Asa married her. Seconds after the ceremony, Pamela leapt out of her bed and confronted Asa. She proclaimed herself to be the new Mrs. Asa Buchanan and promptly moved to Landview and took her rightful place in the Buchanan dynasty. It was the beginning of a very stormy relationship. Asa tried everything to get Pamela out of his life. He even tried to set her up with Pete O'Neill. The more he ranted and raved, the more he fell in love. In time, Asa decided he wanted Pamela back in his life. However, it was too late. Pamela was already involved with Pete. Worse, Pamela planned to sue Asa for divorce and demand half of everything he had. Asa worried the moment he saw Cord Roberts pop up in town. Instantly, he knew by the boy's name that he was Clint's son. He had to get Cord out of Longview. Fearing that Clint would find out the truth, Asa arranged a job for Cord in Phoenix. Cord asked Tina to accompany him, but she said no. By now, she was engaged to Richard Abbott, yet continuing to string Cord along. Cord was devastated when his father, Al Roberts, died suddenly of a heart attack. On his deathbed, Al wrote a letter to Cord, revealing that Clint was his actual father. Before Cord could see the letter, Asa stole it. Returning home to El Paso for Al's funeral, Cord mourned the man who raised him and instilled a sense of morality and fair play in him. Tina flew to attend Al's funeral, and before returning to Longview, she and Cord made passionate love. Unbeknownst to anyone, just days before his fatal heart attack, Al had confessed the 20-year-old secret that Cord was Clint's son to, of all people, Mitch Lawrence, who was pretending to be a minister. Released from prison, Mitch Lawrence returned to Longview in the summer of 1986. More than ever, he was determined to make Tina's life miserable. Mitch adopted a wholesome new image, posing as a modern-day evangelist. In truth, he was a ruthless drug dealer and cult leader who recruited and drugged young women like wholesome Joy O'Neill, sensitive Allison Perkins, and teenager Mari Lynn Dennison to do his dirty work. Mitch provided Tina with a bit of tantalizing news when he informed her of a secret he had unearthed. Cord Roberts was Clint Buchanan's son. The news stunned Tina, who was set to elope with Richard Abbott. Her head spinning, Tina kept Richard at bay as she contemplated her next move. Should she string both men along? Should she elope with respectable Richard? Or should she marry a Buchanan who didn't know he was a Buchanan? Quickly, she made a decision. Tina dumped Richard and eloped with Cord. Using the information to her own advantage, Tina confronted Asa and blackmailed him into changing his will so that Cord would immediately receive $1 million under the guise that the funds were left to him in Al Roberts' will. Tina had what she wanted all along. She was rich. Reporter Cassie Callison, whose marriage to Rob Coronel ended in divorce in 1986, began investigating Mitch Lawrence's operations and nearly fell victim to his sensual charms. Learning of Cassie's tantalizing $1 million trust fund, Mitch attempted to woo her. And Cassie, eager to get to the bottom of Mitch's dirty empire, pretended to fall under his spell. Eventually, Mitch discovered Cassie's charade. When he attacked her, Cassie fought back desperately, striking him with a candlestick. Enraged and disoriented, Mitch knocked Cassie unconscious, then climbed on top of her. He was going to rape Cassie. However, just before he committed the dirty deed, a pair of hands picked up the weapon and hit him over the head. Mitch Lawrence was dead. Upon regaining consciousness, Cassie reacted in horror at seeing Mitch's corpse at her feet. Had she killed Mitch? Dorian rushed in, gathered up any incriminating evidence of Cassie's presence, and hurried her daughter out. Despite Dorian's efforts, Mitch's chief disciple fingered Cassie as the killer. She went to trial, but the charges were dropped when Dorian confessed to killing Mitch. Dorian stood trial, and though she professed to killing Mitch in self-defense, there was no proof to back her claim. Dorian was prosecuted by newly arrived District Attorney Judith Sanders. The savvy Ms. Sanders was joined in Longview by her husband Charles and their two children, Kate, a brainy and beautiful archaeologist, and Jamie, a troublemaking con artist who was secretly involved in drug trafficking in Longview. Judith's dashing brother, private investigator Jonathan Russell, had recently come to Landview and quickly became the latest in Dorian Lord's long line of lovers. In court, Judith Sanders presented a convincing case against Dorian, who, in rapid time, was convicted of murder and remanded to Statesville Prison. Dressed in drab prison gray, Dorian encountered the wrath of an incorrigible inmate, Tiny. However, when Tiny suffered an epileptic seizure, Dorian, a former doctor, saved her life. From that day forward, the rotund Tiny and Dorian were the best of friends. Lucky for Dorian, a hidden recorder had captured Mitch's death on audio tape. When the telltale tape, lifted and hidden by one of Mitch's robot-like disciples, eventually surfaced, Dorian was exonerated. Vicky passed out cold when she got her first look at newcomer Tom Dennison. He was in town at the behest of Cord's mother, the devious Maria Roberts, who'd noted his resemblance to Vicky's late husband, Joe Riley. Maria was hoping that Joe's double could drive a wedge in Clint and Vicky's marriage because Maria wanted Clint for herself. After she found out that Tom could be Joe's long-lost brother, Vicky took him to her cabin in the mountains. There, looking through Joe's old papers, they found Joe's birth certificate, which confirmed that he was born a twin. An old love letter from Joe moved and upset Vicky, who found comfort in Tom's arms. The excitement of this revelatory day proved too much for the very pregnant Vicky. She went into labor. In a blinding storm, Tom raced Vicky to the hospital, where she gave birth to a bouncing baby daughter, Jessica. Clint and Vicky shared in the joy of their first child together. However, soon after Jessica's birth, disaster struck. Before he died, Mitch Lawrence had planted a post-hypnotic suggestion in the brain of one of his faithful disciples, Allison Perkins. From the grave, Mitch instructed Allison to steal Vicky's baby and make it look as if Nikki Smith was the kidnapper. Wearing a Nikki-like red wig and a flashy dress, Allison ventured into Landfair and absconded with Jessica. While the authorities, Clint and Vicky, frantically combed Landview for the missing baby, Allison took the child to her mother's house in New Jersey. Maria Roberts found out about Allison and manipulated the situation so that Clint suspected Vicky had once again turned into Nikki and taken Jessica. Vicky was angry at Clint's suspicions, and it caused a rift between them. By the time Maria had gotten Allison to return, Jessica, Clint, and Vicky had broken up. Their second marriage was over.